Chapter 567. After that, all the technicians in Chaldea were summoned by Olga Marie to work overtime all night. For Chaldeas, which had lost its light, Chaldeas began a deep observation and came to a conclusion. The last time we can confirm the existence of the light of civilization is only 2019. What did that mean? It meant that human beings could only survive until 2019, and they would be completely extinct before 2020. After learning about that, almost everyone had only one thought. Impossible. That's right. Impossible. If human history will disappear before 2020, doesn't that mean that the next less than 2 years will be the last time human beings will survive? How is that possible? There is no possibility of economic collapse, and there is no sign of crustal change. How can human beings suddenly become extinct? That was simply inexplicable. In this regard, Lev gave an explanation. If the cause does not exist in the future, then it can only exist in the past. That is, in the past era, there was a sudden anomaly at some point in time, which led to the extinction of mankind. Therefore, Chaldea conducted a careful investigation of the intelligence in the past 2,000 years. Investigate those things that did not exist in the history so far. Investigate those foreign objects that did not exist in the Earth so far. They existed in violation of the normal space-time order, had an impact on human reason, and then produced the changes of the era. That was the singularity. Spatial singularity, point F. That was a singularity that existed in the past era after all the technicians in Chaldea investigated the history of the past 2,000 years. Chaldea assumed that this was the cause of the extinction of mankind. After learning that information, Olga Marie immediately made a decision. Send a proposal to the United Nations to obtain permission to transfer Reiki. That was the conclusion. Because Reiki transfer was a technology that could go to various eras and affect space-time, if it was carried out casually, it may lead to changes in history. Therefore, to carry out a formal Reiki transfer, they must obtain permission from all countries in the world. Once this permission was issued, the suitable people who were summoned to Chaldea would become master candidates. As combat personnel, Reiko would be transferred to the Singularity Point F. At that time, the heroic spirit summoning system, Fate, would also be officially launched. It would try to summon servants, let master candidates form a contract with servants, and become a real master, command servants, and fight in singularities, eliminate the source of the disappearance of human history, restore the era, and complete the foundation of humanity. This will be the first official battle in Chaldea, and all master candidates must give me a proper attitude. Don't forget, you will be the key to the survival of human history. If you can't correct your attitude and realize the importance of this matter, then no matter how good this person is, I will not allow him to participate in the first battle in a month. Olga Marie said those words to the 9 suitable people who were currently in Chaldea, and then turned her eyes to Reynolds. There was no longer any of the anxiety and anger in his eyes. There was only a determination to struggle with all his might. Then Olga Marie said these words to Renaud. If you don't want to be serious, then don't come. That was Olga Marie's decision. After saying that, Olga Marie turned and left. The rest of the suitable people also looked at Reynolds with various thoughts in their eyes and left the central control room. In the end, Reynolds also left under Thompson and Roman's worried gaze. Walking in the corridor, Reynolds couldn't help but clench his fists. His mood was very complicated from beginning to end. Chaldea, underground training ground. This was the place provided by Chaldea for the suitable people to use. Although magicians basically have their own workshops and will not easily show their skills in other places, it was not impossible to practice and research magic in an open space. Therefore, Chaldea will provide a training ground like this. As long as an application is submitted, it can be used after the application is approved. Reynolds has been in Chaldea for a long time, and he was the first among the suitable people, so he naturally has the authority to use the training ground freely. Right now, Reynolds was shooting from here. Along with some fluctuations, pitch-black mana gathered at Reynolds' fingertips, forming a reddish-black light bullet. The next moment, the red-black light bullet was shot from Reynolds's fingertips, like a bullet cutting through the air and landing on a target in front of him. Bang! With a heavy thud, the target was sent flying. Reynolds continued to aim at the target one by one and kept shooting, hitting the target one by one. Not knowing how long it took, a voice came from behind Reynolds. As expected of Senpai. Behind Reynolds, Townsend had arrived at some point. Foe was standing on his shoulder, smiling at Reynolds. Senpai's Gander can cause substantial damage. It's very powerful. Gander was a magic from Northern Europe. Its essence was a curse. As long as you use your finger to point at the target, it can affect the target's health. Therefore, it was also called Een Bullet. Originally, this magic should be a non-lethal magic. Although it could cause physical abnormalities to the target, it would not cause direct damage. However, if it was practiced to a certain extent, it could also cause direct damage to the target. Because this magic was not particularly rare, Reynolds found it in Chaldea's library and learned it. This magic was also the only magic Reynolds mastered in addition to summoning. Of course, Reynolds also wanted to learn other magic. Unfortunately, except for summoning, Reynolds's talent in other magic was not very amazing. Therefore, Reynolds only learned Enchi Bomb because he didn't want to bite off more than he could chew. After 3 years of practice, Reynolds' Enchi Bomb was able to cause direct damage, and its power was comparable to a bullet. It was not difficult for him to send an adult flying, let alone hit a target. In this regard, Reynolds did not get carried away. In addition to summoning, this is the only magic I can use. Reynolds didn't turn around and continue to shoot. He only replied with one sentence. Looking at Reynolds, Townsend hesitated for a while before plucking up the courage to ask. Chapter 568. Isn't Senpai going to participate in the first battle after a month? That sentence changed the atmosphere in the training ground. Bang! As if symbolizing his mood at this time, the red-black magic bullet heavily hit a target in a way that was more powerful than any of the previous shots, causing it to fly into the wall and directly shatter into pieces. Reynolds breathed a sigh of relief. As if he didn't want to continue shooting, he retracted his fingertips that had been releasing magic power. However, Reynolds still didn't look back and looked at Townsend. There was no other reason. If Townsend saw his current expression, Reynolds was not confident that he could hide his true thoughts. Although Reynolds said that, he didn't hide his inner thoughts at all and spoke out his answer. To be honest, I don't know. That was Reynolds' truest thought. At that moment, Reynolds' mind was filled with Roman's words. Chaldea is no longer the cruel facility you imagined. So, at least here, I hope you can let your guard down. Roman really hoped so, right? However, Reynolds still couldn't trust Chaldea. That was not only because of his disgust with the magician, but also because of Reynolds' past. In view of that, Reynolds really didn't want to cooperate with Chaldea's action. But if the battle fails, there will be no future for mankind. Townsend hugged Foe, looked at Reynolds' back, and whispered, "Senpai, do you think it's okay?" That question was the key point that confused Reynolds. Was it okay? How could it be okay? Regardless of whether he could save the human race or not, Reynolds couldn't just watch Townsend and Roman die without doing anything. Not to mention, Reynolds didn't want to die. Not because of fear. As early as 14 years ago, Reynolds had already accurately recognized death. He had also long since given up on the fear that arose from it. However, Reynolds didn't want to let the life that survived because of a miracle wither so easily. If Singularity F was not repaired, not only Townsend and Roman, but even Reynolds himself would not be spared. On the one hand, Reynolds didn't want to cooperate with Chaldea's action due to his inner resistance. On the one hand, for the sake of Townsend, Roman, and himself, Reynolds couldn't just watch the foundation of humanity fail. The two feelings made Reynolds not know what choice to make. What should he do? At this time, Reynolds couldn't help but feel a little distressed. At that moment, Reynolds stopped thinking about his own question and turned to ask Townsend. "What about Townsend?" Reynolds asked. "Do you want to participate in the first battle?" Townsend was a little startled as he didn't expect Reynolds to suddenly ask him this question. However, after a while, Townsend replied, "If possible, I don't want to give up the opportunity to fight for the first time. This was Townsend's answer. Reynolds only had one thought about this. That's really your style. This was the only thought Reynolds could make. Lindley had been with Townsend for about 2 years at the very most. Reynolds believed that he knew Townsend's character quite well. Renaud turned around and looked at Townsend. Her pink shoulder-length hair hung down very smoothly, as if every strand of her hair could be seen clearly. Every line was distinct. One side of her bangs just covered one eye, and she wore a pair of flat-rimmed glasses on her face. She was wearing a white uniform with a short skirt. Her seemingly healthy thighs were wrapped in pantyhose, and she wore long boots. As for her figure, it was slim and graceful. Considering her age, she was undoubtedly too well-developed. Such a young girl would often have a pitiful expression on her face that was full of seriousness and illusory. At first glance, this was an indifferent girl with an inconceivable atmosphere. In fact, Townsend was not cold, but she was not good at expressing her feelings. Like Reynolds, she had little experience in life, but she had a lot of knowledge. Usually, Townsend was a quiet person, and when she talked to others, she adopted a straightforward attitude and a habit of speaking, as if she was controlling herself. She would only speak when necessary, giving others a feeling that she was hard to approach. In fact, Townsend was a curious and proactive person. She would greet others, talk to others, and ask for their opinions. She was serious and hardworking and was curious about the outside world. She was just a kind and pure girl who wanted to explore the wider world. As for an ordinary girl, it was natural that she would not like to fight. Therefore, Reynolds knew Townsend did not join the battle because she liked it. Quite the contrary, Townsend was afraid of fighting. It was just that she was forced to fight, so she wanted to work hard to overcome the difficulties. The same went for this first battle. Townsend only had one choice when faced with a battle that she was forced to fight. She would work hard to overcome the difficulties. This was something that only Reynolds knew about. Because of that, Reynolds had to ask, "Townsend, do you think this is okay?" Reynolds couldn't help but ask. The pure and kind girl before his eyes had the same past as Reynolds. Both of them were unbearable to look back on. Townsend's fate was even crueler than Reynolds. At least, Reynolds had been saved. But Townsend hadn't. This made Reynolds have to ask that question. "Don't you hate Chaldea?" Such a question made Townsend slightly widen her eyes. Then, Townsend showed a smile. Very shallow, very light, but very beautiful smile. "Yes, I don't hate Chaldea," Townsend replied with a smile, "because it allowed me to meet my predecessor." The gratitude and warmth in her heartfelt words touched Reynolds' heart. Reynolds couldn't not understand the meaning of this sentence. This reminded Reynolds of the scene when he first met Townsend. Townsend seemed to recall the things at that time, and the expression on her face became more and more gentle. Seeing such an expression, Reynolds knew he didn't have a second choice. "I'm really defeated by you." Reynolds also showed a smile. The distress in his heart had disappeared. Compared to the resistance to Chaldea and the magician, Reynolds didn't want to see the girl's smile disappear. This was Reynolds' truest thought now. Compared with this, the resistance in his heart was no longer important. Chapter 569. In any case, he couldn't let the girl in front of him fight alone. That's what Reynolds must do. "So, let's work together." "Townsend." "Yes." "Senpai." In the training ground, the boy and the girl made a strong and powerful declaration to each other. One relaxed, and the other showed a surprised expression. Fo, who was lying in Townsend's arms, seemed to feel the bond and warmth between the two, and also made a sound. On this day, Reynolds made the decision to fight. In order to take back the future of mankind, he embarked on a long journey. In the following period of time, the entire Chaldea entered a state of complete chaos. All the technicians were mobilized by Olga Marie and concentrated in various facilities in Chaldea to investigate and observe the situation of Singularity Point F. They have been trying to summarize information and countermeasures. The staff were given a task one after another. Some went to the United Nations to obtain the official permission to transfer Reiki, and some began to go around the world according to Olga Marie's instructions to gather talents suitable for Reiki transfer and master Reiki transfer. In order to ensure the success of the first battle after a month, Olga Marie could be said to be desperate. At this time, as long as it can increase the odds of winning the battle, no matter what it is, Olga Marie will do it. Even as Olga Marie's most trusted technician, Rafe also devoted himself to work and disappeared. Even Roman was wantonly driven. In order to keep the busy staff from collapsing due to mental and physical exhaustion, he was so busy that he almost didn't have time to eat. Roman himself was so sad. There is still magic, Melly's update this month. Roman screamed so miserably that he didn't even say a word. In the whole month, he only saw Reynolds a few times. The rest of the time, he was running around every corner of Chaldea, taking care of the health of all the people in Chaldea. By the way, the so-called magic, Melly referred to the blog of an online idol. Roman was a die-hard fan of this blog. He loved it so much that he even treated it as spiritual food. Every day, he would linger on this blog for a long time. He was keen on constantly posting comments and then being scolded by the other party as punishment. This made Reynolds, who was also keen on surfing the internet, feel somewhat unimpressed. He had considered several times whether or not to sever ties with this embarrassing fellow. Under such circumstances, in a month's time, the Master Reiki was constantly summoned to Chaldea. As for these suitable individuals, they were naturally drilled. In order to achieve a brilliant result in the first battle, Olga Marie almost madly gave instructions. All master candidates must undergo a certain degree of simulation training. I will issue the permission. From now on, every master candidate can freely participate in the simulation battle. No, they must participate in the simulation battle training every day. In summary, while the technicians and staff were busy, the suitable people, including Reynolds, were also unable to rest. They threw themselves into the simulation battle more frequently than before and underwent rigorous training. Of course, this made many master candidates who had just arrived in Chaldea cry. After all, if they couldn't adapt to the infiltration of Reiki, it would be a great burden on the brain. Under such frequent simulation battles, those who had just gathered in Chaldea and had not been trained, of course, would cry. On the contrary, Reynolds, whose physical strength was far lower than others, was active in the simulation battle. At least, that's what people in Chaldea said about Reynolds. Number 1's simulation battle evaluation is full score. Is it full score again this time? Didn't that guy always give up after passing? Did he start to work hard recently? In front of the doomsday, that guy is nervous, right? If only he could be so diligent in normal times. Those were the comments given by the people in Chaldea after hearing Reynolds' performance. Even those master candidates were looking at Reynolds in all sorts of ways. After learning these things, those who knew Reynolds also had different reactions. As expected of a senior, this was the reaction that Townsend, who had been fighting with Renault every day, was proud of. Are you finally willing to take it seriously? That was the laughter of Roman, who was very busy. Is this Reynolds' real ability? That was Rafe's whisper when he occasionally heard others' comments about Reynolds. It should be like this from the beginning, idiot. Olga Marie, who had heard of this from the report, snorted coldly. As a result, it was those who had gathered in Chaldea in the past month who were disdainful of it. It's just a wild magician who came from nowhere. It's probably because he's more suitable, but that kind of physique doesn't prove anything at all. Yes, we, the noble successors from the Magic Association, are the real elites. That was the reaction of those who were suitable. Magic Association. It was a fraternity where people who studied magic as a subject gathered. Regardless of nationality or school, it was formed by people who learned magic, managed and hid magic, and developed it as a mission. That was the Magic Association. In the magic world, the status of the Magic Association could be said to be unparalleled. Disregarding everything else, just the history of its existence alone was already more than 2,000 years old. Therefore, except for a few magicians like Reynolds, who had been staying in Chaldea and silently learning magic, the magicians in the magic world usually belong to this association. That made the Magic Association gather almost all the famous magicians from ancient times to the present. Among them, Olga Marie's family was included. In other words, strictly speaking, Chaldea was also a facility belonging to the Magic Association. The more famous the magician was, the better the magic circuit, and the more powerful the magician was. That was why the magicians in the association generally valued bloodline above everything else. In the eyes of these people, Reynolds, who wasn't well known, was naturally a wild kid that had started out halfway, and it caused them to feel disdain and contempt towards him from the bottom of their hearts. Of course, not everyone was like that. Not all of the magicians who had Reiki transfer adaptability and master adaptability came from the association. Some of them were ordinary people who had magic circuit. Chapter 570. 38 people were selected from the famous magic clans. 10 people were selected from ordinary people. There will be a total of 48 of them gathered in Chaldea. Rely on these 48 masters to lay a new foundation for human history and return human history to normal. Olga Marie, who calculated the combat power, once announced this to Reynolds and others. In this way, a month passed. In the end, all 48 masters were gathered in Chaldea. It was also on this day that the battle began. Clap! Reynolds closed the laptop in his hand. His fingers gently stroked its surface, curled his lips, and smiled. I hope I can come back again. Leaving such words, Reynolds left his room and went to the door. Here, the obedient juniors have been waiting for a long time. Good morning, Senpai. Good morning, Townsend. Did you play games all night last night? Well, Senpai, don't worry, I won't mess it up. The two had a simple conversation at the door. Immediately, they left together and went to the control room. Today, the whole Chaldea was filled with a faint tension, and the air began to carry a trace of pressure. Senpai, Townsend seemed to feel the tension. Not only his face was slightly tense, but he also couldn't help but call Reynolds. Renaud, who was yawning and looking completely different from Townsend, glanced at Townsend and saw the tense expression on his face. Relax. Reynolds suddenly yawned and said, Don't be so nervous. The simulation battle has been done many times. There's no problem. If it had been Olga Marie, she would have definitely complained about his careless attitude. However, Townsend was affected by Reynolds' attitude, and his mood was slightly relaxed. Clearly seeing this scene, Reynolds smiled in his heart and relaxed. Obviously, Reynolds deliberately made this performance for Townsend's sake, so that Townsend could relax. People are creatures that can be influenced by each other. Once the people around you are nervous, you will be more or less nervous. However, once the people around him were sloppy, it was impossible to be serious. Using this principle, Reynolds deliberately guided Townsend, who was not very mature yet. Although the two of them were the same age and lacked life experience, Renaud was better at devising strategies and countermeasures than the pure and kind Townsend. Naturally, he knew how to make Townsend relax in this situation. This was also because Reynolds was very clear about his position. As a summoning magician who manipulated familiars to fight, his physical strength could not keep up, but his mind must be clear. The battle would be left to the servants and familiars. His mission was to command and support from the rear. Only then could he maximize his combat strength. Reynolds had always been very clear about this, so he had been absorbing all kinds of knowledge to enrich his mind, making it easier for him to organize tactics and command in all kinds of situations. This battle was the same. In terms of fighting, as long as it is servant, a magician won't be able to keep up. As masters, what we should do is not to go to the front lines, but to command from the rear. If you don't do that, you'll just be a burden. With this understanding, Reynolds naturally knew what he should do the most. In addition, he was also a summoning magician, and his combat method was also to control familiars from the rear. Thinking of this, Reynolds couldn't help but look forward to it. I don't know what kind of hero will be summoned by fate and contracted with me. When he thought of this, Reynolds was really looking forward to it. Love magic, love miracles. That's the boy, Lorelei Agneson. At this time, so you're here. The voice sounded, and Reynolds took the lead to stop going to the control room. Professor, Townsend also stopped in his tracks, but unlike Reynolds, he bowed to the newcomer in a serious manner. The person who came was Rafe. I've been looking for you for a long time. It's great that you're here. Rafe was leaning on a decorative cane, with a normal smile, approaching them. Reynolds didn't greet Rafe, he just looked at him. For some reason, Reynolds always felt that. This guy is even more creepy now. Reynolds couldn't open his mouth to greet Rafe, he could only remain silent. Rafe, who didn't know what Reynolds was thinking, walked in front of them. Are you ready to go to the control room? Lev said enthusiastically. Mary is preparing to give a briefing to the master candidates who have gathered in Chaldea. You two are the only ones left. Hurry up. Reynolds raised his eyebrows when he heard that. Could it be that the professor is looking for us? Reynolds asked tentatively. In response, Rafe gave a straightforward answer. After all, the two of you are not selected from a famous magic sect, nor are you ordinary people from the general society. You belong to the Chaldea from the beginning, and you both have more precious talents than the average person. On such an important day, you can't be absent. Although the answer was straightforward, Reynolds still felt Rafe's intention. Yes, on such an important day, you can't be absent. Rafe smiled so frankly. However, that smile and those words made Reynolds feel a chill crawl up his spine. However, before Reynolds could find out, Rafe changed the topic and said, By the way, do you know where Romani is? I'm looking for him too. Hearing Rafe's words, Townsend was a little surprised and said, Isn't the doctor in the control room? He was here just now. Rafe shook his head and said, It's just that the recent overtime made Romani have been shouting in the control room. I want to take a vacation. I want to see Magic Melly's update. Let me take a break. Mary got angry and said that if he was there, the atmosphere of the battle couldn't be lifted at all, so she drove him away. It was Romani's style. That was Reynolds and Townsend's first thought. That being said, today's battle is very important. In order to avoid physical problems, we still need Romani's care. Rafe asked Reynolds, Do you know where your brother is? Reynolds? Chapter 571. To be honest, Reynolds really knew. Not long ago, Roman had rushed into Reynolds' room and shouted at him. Today I'm going to be lazy. If someone is looking for me, remember to say that I'm not here. Then, Roman hid in Reynolds' bathroom. In other words, now, Roman was hiding in Reynolds' room. So I don't know. Reynolds simply said to Lev, Maybe he's hiding somewhere to be lazy. Is that so? Lev was silent for a while, then said helplessly, There is no other way. The battle is about to start. We will go first, and see if we can contact Romani later. After that, Lev took the lead as if he wanted to lead the way. Townsend was about to follow, but he saw Reynolds standing in the same place, hesitating. Senpai? Townsend tilted his head and asked, What's wrong? No. Fondly shook his head and pretended to be relaxed. Nothing. Let's follow. Yes. Although Townsend still had some doubts, he didn't ask. The two followed Lev and went to the control room again. However, Reynolds was no longer as undisciplined as he was just now. Staring at Lev's back, Reynolds' eyes flashed. I always feel that something is wrong. In Reynolds' mind, there was only this thought left. Unfortunately, things didn't stop because of Reynolds' mind. Not long after, the three of them came to the control room and began to take their places. Chaldea, Central Control Room. When Reynolds and Mashu arrived, all the suitable people in Chaldea had gathered. All the suitable people were sitting in rows of seats in the center of the control room, silently waiting for the battle meeting to begin. Just in front of these people, Olga Marie was already standing there. Too slow. As usual, Olga Marie shouted at Reynolds and Mashu. Hurry up and sit down. Don't waste time. Olga Marie's voice was more nervous than usual, which told others that today's anxiety level had broken the record. If it was in the past, Olga Marie would never easily let go of Reynolds, who was always unpleasant to her eyes. This proved that Olga Marie didn't even have the time to quarrel with Reynolds. Looking at Olga Marie, who crossed her arms and stared at him, Reynolds couldn't help but feel sad. Why are you so angry every day? I wonder if your menopause has come early, say, Senior. Reynolds' slander made Mashu afraid of being heard. She quickly pulled Reynolds back to his seat. The two of them were seated in the first row. There were less than 10 seats in the first row. Those who were able to sit here were the 9 people who were already in Chaldea a month ago. These 9 people naturally attracted the attention of everyone present. Welcome to Chaldea, the Secret Service. I am the director, Olga Marie Animosfia. While the rest of the people were looking at Renaud and Mashu in the first row with disrespectful eyes, Olga Marie began to speak. Although there are many things I want to say, to be exact, I feel very uneasy when I see all of you like this. However, it is undeniable that this battle requires the strength of suitable people like you who have been excavated from all over the world to successfully complete it. Therefore, I will not beat around the bush and get straight to the point. Olga Marie seemed to suppress the anxiety in her heart and spoke in a calm voice. Presumably, after coming to Chaldea, you should have more or less understood the current situation, right? These words made the master candidates present look at each other. After all, it was such a big thing. Mankind was about to usher in the end. Even if it was the biggest secret now, it was impossible for the outside world to know. But after coming to Chaldea, the people here must have already known it. Therefore, Olga Marie said this. I don't care whether you heard it from others or from other channels. Now, how serious our situation is, as long as you can clearly understand this point, it is enough. And if you still don't understand the seriousness of the situation, then let me repeat it to you. Olga Marie announced mercilessly. Next, your battle will determine whether mankind can survive in the future. When these words came out, the audience was silent. Olga Marie continued to announce coldly. If your battle is successful, then the history of mankind can be repaired, and the future of mankind can be guaranteed. If your battle fails, then mankind will be completely finished. There are only these 2 results, and there will never be a third. Now, do you understand how heavy your mission is? Hearing this, everyone's face began to tense slightly. A sense of nervousness spread in the control room. Reynolds also felt that Mashu's body next to him was tense, and her delicate face also changed. He couldn't help but curse in his heart. It's not easy to make Mashu relax a little, but this woman is still so troublesome. Reynolds had forgotten that a month ago, he was the most troublesome person in Chaldea. At any rate, Olga Marie seemed to be satisfied with the tension. Since you're already aware, then let's begin the real explanation of the battle. Olga Marie's expression began to become serious. Immediately, Olga Marie finally began to explain. After this period of observation and investigation, Chaldea finally confirmed the location of the singularity point F. After that, Olga Marie snapped her fingers. Chaldea, which was in the front, suddenly turned around and faced everyone in the room. At the same time, there is a screen in front of it, like a lens, magnifying one of the points of the planet model and presented it in front of everyone. Reynolds raised his head and looked at it. What appeared there was an island country located in the Far East. Olga Marie pointed to one of the locations in the island country. There's a city here called Fuyuki City. Fuyuki City. When this name was mentioned, the expressions of some of the master candidates from the famous magic sects changed slightly. Even Reynolds narrowed his eyes and whispered to Mashu on the side. Senpai, isn't Fuyuki City? Well, let's continue to listen. After exchanging opinions, the two continued to listen to the explanation. Olga Marie continued to explain as if she expected this reaction. Chapter 572. The history from 2004 until 2018 does not exist here. That is to say, Fuyuki City at this point in time has been separated from the torrent of time and became a whole, a singularity. Your task is to transfer Reiko to Fuyuki City in 2004 and find out the reason for the disappearance of human beings in the future. Olga Marie retracted her hand from the map and looked around at the masters. This is the first Reiko transfer battle since the establishment of Chaldea. For this reason, we have no clue what kind of problems and difficulties you will encounter. However, As long as we don't cross this hurdle, human beings will have no future. So, your battle can only succeed, and failure is absolutely not allowed. Olga Marie spoke again in a loud voice after giving such an order that left no room for explanation. Now, as the current director of Chaldea, after an hour, the first Reiko transfer experiment will be officially carried out. To be conservative, we will select the top 8 people in the simulation battle so far to form Team A and send them to the singularity first. The members of Team A have received sufficient training in Chaldea a month ago. They are talents who can stand on their own. They will set off first to provide security for the follow-up personnel in the singularity. During Team A's operation, the members of Team B and below need to be ready to set off after the second experiment. After that, Olga Marie clapped her hands. After the battle meeting, about 10 minutes passed. In those 10 minutes, the master candidates have already landed on their respective capsules and waited for orders to enter them at any time to perform Reiki transfer. Renaud was also waiting next to his own capsule. It's really annoying. Next to his capsule, Renaud was muttering with an unhappy face. On the other side, Mashu, who was also waiting next to her capsule, said as if she had accepted the fact. I didn't expect that Senpai would be excluded from Team A's list. Yes, Renaud was not on Team A's list. A month ago, there were a total of 9 masters in Chaldea who were eligible for the position. Team A, on the other hand, would select the top 8 contestants in the simulated battle. In this way, one of them would naturally be left alone. Unfortunately, this lone person was none other than Reynolds, who asked Senior not to be serious in the previous simulation battles. Mashu helplessly explained the reason. This was the fundamental reason. Although in this month, Reynolds was unprecedentedly active, almost every simulation battle got full marks. But before this, Reynolds had never taken the simulation battle seriously. He didn't just get a pass, he didn't even get a pass. Sometimes he was absent or late. All of these were recorded in Chaldea's computer as real results. As such, Reynolds' result was ranked last, and he was successfully left alone. Actually, it didn't matter if he was alone or not. With the people from Team A paving the way for him, Reynolds was happy and relaxed. However, Mashu was one of the members of Team A. How could Reynolds feel at ease letting this girl, who was afraid of battle, lead the way to the singularity in advance? It's all right, Senior. Mashu seemed to see the worry in Reynolds' heart. So she said very seriously, I will definitely pave the way for Senior and persevere until Senior arrives. This was not flaunting but being strong. Even if she was afraid of fighting, Mashu did not intend to escape from the battle, let alone hide behind Reynolds. In the face of this girl's strength, Reynolds could not say anything to refute. There is no other way. Reynolds could only say to Mashu, then you have to be careful. Yes, I know. Mashu nodded heavily. Reynolds reluctantly stopped complaining, turned his head, and looked at the direction of the command room. There, a group of Chaldea technicians were in full swing, performing the final adjustments of the Reiki transfer, constantly manipulating various instruments. Olga Marie was also wandering among the technicians, constantly giving instructions. Reynolds glanced at the situation and then frowned. Senior? Seeing Reynolds' abnormality again, Mashu could not help but ask. But this time, Reynolds had no spare energy to respond to Mashu. Reynolds just stared at the direction of the command room. His expression was extremely serious. Because there was a person who Reynolds had to pay attention to. Where's Rafe? It was Rafe. After carefully searching the interior of the command room, Reynolds still did not find Rafe's figure. This reminded Reynolds of the strange feeling he felt when he first met Rafe. This strange feeling, now with Rafe's disappearance, grew stronger and stronger in Reynolds' heart. In the end, it grew to the point that Reynolds was restless. How could that man suddenly disappear at such an important moment? The more he thought about it, the more Reynolds felt concerned. So, son, Senior, where you going? Mashu's horrified voice sounded. At the same time, the rest of the master candidates also cast a stunned and surprised look at Reynolds one by one. Reynolds did not care about this. While running out of the control room, he shouted at Mashu without looking back. "I will be back soon." After shouting, Reynolds rushed out of the control room under Mashu's call and the whispers of the crowd. Faintly, it seemed to be accompanied by Olga Marie's roar. "Lorelei, Agnes!" Reynolds ran out of the control room without looking back when he heard his name being yelled out. Ha! 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 Not long after running out of the control room, Reynolds felt that his stamina was almost exhausted. If it were any other time, Reynolds would have already complained and directly fell to the ground. But this time, Reynolds kept consuming his stamina, running in the corridor of Chaldea, and even used the bird summoning magic to summon dozens of birds and scattered them in Chaldea. Reynolds ran and searched while dividing his spirit into dozens of parts, sharing his senses with the tamed monsters, looking for Rafe's trace. Being able to divide his senses into dozens of parts like this while doing his own thing, it showed that Reynolds' ability was excellent. But not here. Reynolds, who had one hand on the wall, couldn't help but feel a little surprised. How could that not be? Chapter 573. Obviously, he had divided his senses into dozens of parts and searched the whole Chaldea with a group of tamed birds, but he couldn't even find Lev's trace. Did he hide in some important facility or workshop? Or did he just leave Chaldea? The former was an important place, so it was generally set up with a defense system and enchantment, and the tamed demons couldn't get in. Not to mention the latter. Once Rafe really left Chaldea, it would be impossible to find him. No, that's not the problem. Why at such an important moment, Rafe not only left the control room, but also disappeared. A bad premonition has been growing in Reynolds' heart. Unfortunately, Reynolds' premonition was only accurate when it came to bad things. Therefore, that thing happened. For Reynolds and the people closest to him, it was enough to decide their fate. Boom! A muffled sound suddenly resounded without any warning, making the whole Chaldea seem to be shaking, and there was a rumbling sound. What happened? Reynolds couldn't help but be surprised. In the next second, an alarm sounded throughout Chaldea. There is an emergency. There is an emergency. There is a fire in the central power station and the central control room. The wall in the central area will be blocked in 240 seconds. Please leave from the second gate quickly. Repeat. The central power station and the cold and ruthless alarm sounded, and the whole Chaldea began to deal with the fire under the flashing red light. Reynolds' mind was completely blank. Fire? Control room? These two words flashed through Reynolds' mind. Before he could react, Reynolds ran wildly in the direction of the control room, because there were people who were very important to Reynolds. Mashu! Reynolds screamed from his throat and ran to the control room. Someday in the future, Reynolds would certainly make such an evaluation of himself today. This is the first and the last time in my life that I have to go beyond my physical limit. That was because no matter how tired and weak his body was, the anxiety in his heart still made Reynolds rush to the central control room without caring about anything else. He was so anxious that he didn't even have the energy to summon his familiar. He could only rush forward without stopping. After 240 seconds, the wall in the central area would be completely sealed off. If he didn't rush to the central area before that, Reynolds would never be able to enter that place, let alone rush to that cute junior's side. Therefore, Reynolds was only left with regret. Why did he leave the control room? Why look for Rafe? He had already made up his mind to stay by that girl's side. If I'm still there. Damn it. Realizing that his thoughts had started to turn negative due to uneasiness and anxiety, Reynolds hurriedly shook his head, shaking off the negative emotions and the sweat on his forehead. Now is not the time to blame yourself. The most important thing now was to find Mashu. He allowed his body to be driven by such emotions. Reynolds seemed to want to squeeze out all the strength in his body and finally rush to the front of the control room. Chee! The automatic door suddenly opened with a whistle-like effect, telling Reynolds that he had successfully arrived. However, the next moment, the scene that entered his eyes made Reynolds stop. Red. Hot red. The control room, which used to be cold and full of mechanical feeling, was now covered by a fiery red flame. Pa! 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 The scalding hot pebbles kept rolling in every corner of the room. Bang! The concrete blocks that fell from the ceiling made a muffled sound. The entire control room was covered in flames, as if it was completely blown up and turned into ruins. In such a situation, the alarm was still ringing. It has been confirmed that the power part has stopped. The power generation is insufficient. Switching to the backup power source, there is an abnormality. Please manually switch. There are 90 seconds left before the wall is completely sealed off. The staff in the central area, please go to the second gate as soon as possible. Hearing this, Reynolds finally reacted. Mashu! Renault shouted at the surroundings and rushed into the fire, ignoring the rising temperature. Mashu! Mashu! Where are you? Mashu! Answer me if you hear me! Reynolds shouted as he kept rushing in. Along the way, Reynolds also saw a capsule that was like a pillar that was pushed down, leaning in every corner. Renault looked for them one by one, but what he saw was a master candidate lying in a capsule one by one. However, they all fainted one by one. Seeing this, Reynolds somewhat understood. When the fire broke out, did the master candidates already enter the capsule? That was probably Olga Marie's order, right? Although Reynolds had run out of the control room before the battle, he knew that woman's style. Even if Reynolds was absent, she would not delay the important first battle just because of Reynolds' problem alone. She would definitely continue to give orders in a fit of anger while preparing for the spiritual droplet transfer. Thanks to that, the masters who entered the capsule didn't seem to die because of the sudden fire, and they maintained their life activities through the capsule's protection. So, Mashu was most likely among them, and she did not die because of the fire. Thinking of that, Reynolds thanked Olga Marie for the first time and turned to look for Mashu's capsule. Unfortunately, this time, Reynolds guessed wrong. Phew! Just when Renault was desperately looking for Mashu's capsule, he heard a familiar voice. Reynolds quickly turned his head and saw a white creature standing on a piece of concrete wreckage. Foe, why are you here? Reynolds couldn't help but be stunned. Foe should never appear in front of people, so it should never appear in the control room full of Chaldea's masters and technicians. Foe, ignoring Reynolds' surprise, Foe continued to shout, turned around, and ran in a direction. Seeing that, Reynolds' heart moved. Could it be? Reynolds rushed in the direction Foe ran. It didn't take long for Reynolds to stop again. His mind, however, became completely blank. Foe! Foe called out from under a huge lump of muddy soil. However, it wasn't yelling at Reynolds. It was yelling at the young lady whose lower body was pressed down by a huge chunk of mud. Her lower body had already turned into a pool of blood. Predecessor? The girl's voice was like a bubble that was about to burst. It sounded so illusory. Chapter 574. The person Reynolds was desperately looking for seemed to notice his arrival, and she raised her head with great difficulty and slowly looked in his direction. The glasses she used to wear on her face were broken. Her eyes, which used to be full of seriousness, couldn't be gathered. Reynolds' blank mind was unable to produce any thoughts at all as he was stared at by the pair of eyes whose pupils were dilated as if he could no longer see the things in front of him clearly. It wasn't until half a second later that Reynolds couldn't help but shout, "Why didn't you enter the capsule? Mashu!" With that, Reynolds almost shook his body and rushed to Mashu's side. In this regard, Mashu didn't feel any pain, and she smiled. Because Senpai said he would come back soon, that's it. In order to wait for Reynolds to come back, Mashu didn't enter the capsule to prepare for Reiko transfer, and she eventually became the victim of this sudden fire. Reynolds clenched his fists, gritted his teeth, and could only gasp violently to suppress the intense emotions in his heart. I'll get you out first. After suppressing his emotions, Reynolds activated the magic circuit in his body and let his magical power surge. Summon demonic ants. That was one of the 3 magics Reynolds learned that could summon mid-level servants. The surging magical power suddenly formed a magic square, and ants as huge as dogs were summoned. Kacha, kacha, kacha! The ants rubbed their fong-like mouth parts, making a harsh sound like nails rubbing glass. Reynolds manipulated the demonic ants to scatter around the huge mixed mud block and begin to move it. Boom! More than 10 demonic ants displayed an unimaginable strength. They pushed away a huge chunk of mud that was bigger than a room and rolled it into the fire at the side, causing a roar. "Senpai, don't talk. I'll take you out now." Reynolds squandered his physical strength that had already reached the limit, deliberately not looking at Mashu's miserable lower body, and was ready to carry Mashu on his back. As long as he took Mashu out, Reynolds believed that his lazy brother would have a way to save her. Just when Reynolds was about to move Mashu to the automatic door of the control room and was about to go out, the wall is activated. Central region, seal off. Amidst the cold and merciless announcement, a door rose from the top, bottom, left, and right of the automatic door. They clamped together and sealed the control room. Reynolds stopped for the third time. Looking at the sealed automatic door in front of him, he was speechless. Bang, bang, bang. As the raging fire gradually grew stronger, more and more rocks fell from the ceiling. It was as if the ceiling was about to collapse, causing the entire control room to become shaky and on the verge of collapse, causing bursts of explosive sounds. Reynolds and Mashu both looked at the completely closed door in front of them and fell into silence. Reynolds understood. Whether it was himself or Mashu, they could not leave this place. The door of the control room was specially made, and it was very well designed for magic. Even the most powerful magician would not be able to break it with brute force. Even if they were to use physical means, it would be very difficult to break this door that was stronger than steel. Unless he could summon a high-level familiar, it was worth a try. Otherwise, Reynolds wouldn't be able to escape with his current strength. And if he couldn't escape from here, he would die. Not only Mashu couldn't be saved, but even Reynolds himself would be swallowed by the fire and lose his hard-won life. This was the current situation. For a while, Reynolds didn't know how to react. As for Mashu, her voice sounded. "I'm sorry. Senpai, it's all because of me." Her voice was so fragile that it seemed like it would disappear at any time, and the guilt contained in the voice made people feel distressed. However, for some reason, when Reynolds heard this voice, he felt calm. Obviously, he was about to die, but his mood was incredibly calm, and his feelings were even more simple. "Well, there's nothing I can do about it." Reynolds' voice returned to its usual casual tone, and he smiled as if he was relaxed. This made the thousands of words in Mashu's heart dissipated and turned into a weak but exceptionally beautiful smile. "Senpai, you're really a senpai." Mashu only had this mood left. The raging fire grew stronger again, swallowing Reynolds and Mashu's escape route. Reynolds held Mashu and sat in front of the sealed door, looking at the sea of fire in front of him. "Senpai," not knowing how long it took, Mashu's weak voice sounded again. "Remember when we first met? Do you remember?" This sentence immediately pulled Reynolds' memories back to the past. That was 2 years ago. At that time, Reynolds had been in Chaldea for a year. As the best master candidate in the current record, Reynolds was welcomed by many people when he came to Chaldea. But in that year, Reynolds did not cooperate with Chaldea, which gradually eroded Chaldea's patience and made his interpersonal relationships in Chaldea fall to the lowest point. To put it bluntly, except for Roman, no one else was close to Reynolds at that time. At that time, this was something that Reynolds could not have wished for more. Instead of wasting my time with these guys who are secretly conducting some inhuman magic experiments, I might as well play a game. Reynolds sincerely held these ideas, and at the same time, he also held the resistance to Chaldea and lived alone. Sometimes he practiced magic in places where others didn't know. Sometimes he would be alone in his room playing games. Except for Roman, who came in person to ask Reynolds to go out and cooperate with some inspections, Reynolds did not step out of the door. This was Reynolds' life in Chaldea 2 years ago, a life of complete solitude. Until one day, her name is Mashu Gillett, and she will live in Chaldea like you in the future. You have to get along well. Roman suddenly came to him with a girl who was about the same age as Reynolds and introduced the girl standing next to him. Reynolds still remembered Mashu at that time. Her short hair was no different from today's. Her delicate face was no different from today's. Her wonderful atmosphere was no different from today's. Her intellectual appearance was no different from today's. Chapter 575. The only difference was that he had a slightly immature appearance and a pair of pure eyes that were so calm that it was abnormal. Reynolds knew that gaze. It was the same gaze he had when he was 2 years old, before he obtained a miracle. Thus, Reynolds understood. The girl in front of him was the same as his past self. Both of them had succumbed to their fate and accepted it. So, even if Reynolds didn't know what happened to Avina at that time, Reynolds knew that the girl in front of him was walking the path he had walked before and didn't treat cruelty as cruelty. The moment he understood this, Reynolds could no longer stay by his side alone. Just like how he accepted Roman, Reynolds, who had always rejected others, accepted the girl in front of him. At the same time, Avina also accepted the boy in front of her. Because at that time, Reynolds said something to Avina. In that case, I am your senior. This sentence also pried open Avina's heart. This was the scene when the boy and girl first met. Until now, I still haven't forgotten Senior's words. In the fire, only Avina's weak but peaceful voice, as if it had some warmth, clearly entered Reynolds's ears. For me at that time, Senior was really dazzling. Everyone was like that, right? People would have a kind of longing for someone who was like them, but who had done something they couldn't do. In Avina's heart, Reynolds was such a person. Their past was similar, and in the eyes of others, they were both cruel. However, Reynolds obtained a miracle and escaped from this fate. So, as a girl who hadn't obtained a miracle, Avina felt that this senior was very dazzling, and that was natural. Because of this, Avina could tell anyone from the bottom of her heart. To be able to meet Senior is really great. The girl's honesty made Reynolds' heart become extremely complicated. His words were like this: I'm just luckier than you. This was the truth. Reynolds was just luckier than Avina. Even if a miracle happened, it wasn't something that Reynolds had fought for himself, but a gift that appeared out of nowhere. If this wasn't good luck, then what was? But thanks to this, I was able to meet Avina. In other words, it's great to be able to meet you. Renault's words with a slight chuckle made AI Wayna completely relax. Senior, Avina involuntarily used the last of her strength to hold Reynolds' hand. Reynolds immediately grabbed it back, as if he was holding it tightly in his hand, and continued to exert strength. Under such circumstances, the fire engulfed the entire control room. However, at that moment, the mechanical voice of the system sounded. Detected that the system experiment is in progress. Manual operation stopped. Please resume operation in 3 seconds. No recovery in operation. Switching from manual operation to automatic operation. Continue the experiment. Begin the search for the master. The master in the capsule is detected to be in an abnormal state, and the only master list is number 1, and number 1 is set as the main subject of the experiment. Anti-summoning system, start. Time returned to the second before the fire engulfed the room. Holding the heavily injured Avina's hand tightly, Reynolds' heart was filled with determination. That's the only way. Reynolds couldn't help but clench his hand with Miracle. Reynolds actually had a way to get out of the current crisis. That was to use the power of Miracle to open the door to another world and leave the current time and space, thus avoiding the immediate crisis. It's just, this power is not something that can be used casually. As mentioned before, if you want to open the door to another world other than the soul, you need to pay a price. In addition, there was no way to open the door to another world other than Reynolds. That was to say, even if Raynor could be saved by this method, it would only be Raynor alone, and Avina couldn't pass through the gate alone. Even if he could go to another world through the door, how to save the seriously injured Avina was also a problem. After all, Avina's injury couldn't be delayed. On the other side of the door, there was something that could heal Avina's injury. Reynolds couldn't think that way, but that's the only way now. If he didn't use this method, he would die. If he used this method, there was still a chance. So, did Reynolds have a second choice other than using this method? As for how to let Avina pass through the gate of another world that was only open to him in theory, Reynolds also had a way. Although he didn't want to use this method, but there was no other choice. Just as Reynolds was about to make up his mind, Reiki transfer start. As Chaldea's system voice fell, Reynolds only felt that his existence turned into particles, and in a dazzling, rotating brilliance, he entered a passage. That was a passage to another time and space. Reiki transfer. Reynolds only had time to take a breath, and then a dizziness took over his consciousness. When his consciousness returned to his head and the dizziness disappeared, he didn't know how long it would take. When his vision was fully restored, the scene in front of him entered Reynolds' eyes. Reynolds was stunned. What appeared in front of him was a ruin that was no different from the control room in Chaldea. Flame-like red light wrapped around the collapsed buildings. The road, like a deserted street, stood in all directions. In front of him was a town that turned into ruins and was still burning. Reynolds tried to get ready to grasp the current situation. At that moment, a tingling sensation suddenly came from the back of Reynolds' right hand, which attracted Reynolds' attention. When Reynolds saw the scene on the back of his right hand, a surprised expression appeared on his face. He saw that on the back of Reynolds' right hand, a striking red pattern was branded there. There were a total of 3 lines, as if 3 rings were linked together to form a pattern. From that pattern, Reynolds could feel a huge surge of magical power. That made Reynolds determine what the pattern on the back of his hand was. Is it a spellcaster? Chapter 576. This was an extremely precious command right, a proof that belonged exclusively to the master. It would be connected to the magic circuit of the magician. As long as the magician gave an order to it, it could be used as a kind of magic resource to give a certain degree of order to the servants that were contracted with the magician. In view of this, the command spell could be used to strengthen the servants contracted with him, and it could also be used to heal the servant's injuries. If it was a good magician, he could even use the command spell to bind the servants with a spell similar to a curse. And its appearance naturally meant a servant formed a contract with me. This was the only explanation for the command incantation. It can't be. At this moment, Reynolds was truly at a loss. If it was in the past, Reynolds would have been overjoyed by this situation. After all, forming a contract with a real servant and using the heroic spirit summoning system as a master had always been Reynolds' dream. This wish of his had actually been realized in such a manner, causing Reynolds to completely forget his excitement and could only fall into a daze. Fortunately, Reynolds was a master who specialized in summoning magic. He quickly reacted to this sudden situation. Now is not the time to think about this. Reynolds shifted his attention away from the command incantation on the back of his hand and looked around in panic. Where's Avina? Where did Avina go? This was what he should be thinking about right now. Recalling the touch of the girl who was gradually losing her body temperature in his arms just a second ago, Reynolds immediately prepared to run forward. Unfortunately, this action was stopped in the next instant. Reynolds, who was about to rush out, suddenly froze on the spot. In front of a pair of eyes, at the edge of the abandoned town, a shooting star appeared. Whoosh, 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 whoosh. The sound of something breaking through the air resounded in the sky like a rainstorm. That is arrows. Reynolds could only understand this much. As for running away, it was already too late. The speed of the meteor-like arrow rain that came from the horizon had long surpassed the shooting of the shadow followers that Reynolds had used in the simulation battle. In other words, it was a shot that was above the level of a high-level familiar. Whether it was power, speed, or numbers, they were all superior to the shadow followers that Reynolds had used. In the face of such shots, Reynolds could only shrink his pupils to the size of a needle tip, as if he was watching a slideshow of death. In another second, the rain of arrows would pierce through Reynolds' body and tear him into countless pieces. A death crisis that was even more direct than when he was in the control room was coming straight at him. In the face of such direct death, would Reynolds have a way to resolve it? Magic? There was no time to use it. Avoid? With Reynolds' pitiful physical strength, it was simply unrealistic. If it was before the transfer of spiritual droplets, Reynolds would definitely not have the means to deal with this crisis. But now, Reynolds had a trump card. Clang! A blinding light blossomed from the back of Reynolds' hand. Amidst the command incantation that looked like 3 interlocking rings, one of the rings suddenly faded and turned into a surge of surging magic power. Using this magical power, Reynolds issued an order. "Come to my side, my servant." This order became a reality with the support of a huge amount of magic power. With a clear shout, a black silhouette rushed out of the surging flow of mana like a bolt of lightning, blocking in front of Reynolds. Looking at this figure, Reynolds' eyes widened. Avina, in the harsh sound of the air breaking, meteor-like arrows pierced through the sky and fell on the servant standing in front of Reynolds in the center of the ruins. However, before that, a huge shield was raised like a fortress and received the incoming arrows. Clang! In the midst of the heavy, bell-like sound, the arrows fell on the solid shield. Then, like a chain reaction, the arrows turned into a meteor shower and hit the shield one after another. Clang! 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 The heavy arrows and the solid shield collided with each other, causing a continuous sound. The power formed by the collisions caused strong gales to rise. The strong gales turned into wild gales. The wild gales stirred up gray waves. The gray waves turned into curtains, causing the pitch-black smoke to scatter in all directions, blowing away the surrounding sea of fire. Ugh! Under the onslaught of the choking smoke, Reynolds could not help but raise his hands to block in front of him. He tried his best to stabilize his body to avoid being blown away by the strong wind that was close at hand. It was only an arrow that landed on the shield, but it had already caused such a huge shockwave. This made Reynolds' heart waver a lot. Of course, this wavering was not only because of this, but also because of the changes in front of Reynolds. To be more precise, it was Avina's change. "Senpai, are you okay?" Holding the shield, Avina, who completely blocked the terrible arrows, stared at the front and didn't dare to relax while shouting at Reynolds behind her. In this regard, Reynolds not only didn't feel relieved, but he also wavered even more. "Avina, you! How could you?" Reynolds couldn't even form a complete sentence. Looking carefully, Avina, who was in front of Reynolds, completely disappeared from the white Chaldea uniform that he was used to. Instead, it was replaced by a set of purple armor like a tight skirt. The purple armor was tightly wrapped around Avina's body, outlining Avina's unexpectedly curvy figure. While firmly protecting Avina, it boldly exposed the front half of her shoulders and upper half of her thighs, giving a kind of awe-inspiring and sexy texture. After knowing Aina for 2 whole years, Reynolds had never seen Aina wear such an armor. Her figure was even more voluptuous than he had imagined. Not only did it make Reynolds' heart skip a beat, it also made him completely flustered. What made Reynolds even more shaken was she actually blocked this kind of attack. It was superior to the continuous shooting of a high-level tamed monster. If this kind of continuous shooting appeared in the simulation battle, Reynolds dared to say that the hundreds of intermediate-level lizardmen he faced would definitely be killed in less than 10 seconds. This was not something that ordinary magicians could resist at all. On the other hand, although Avina had a decent aptitude for magic, her combat strength was not necessarily higher than Renault's. Now, even Reynolds was helpless. He could only use the command spell to summon his servant to deal with the attack, but Avina blocked it head-on. Chapter 577. The amazing defensive power, the never-before-seen costume, the terrifying magical fluctuations surging in her body, and the fact that she was summoned with a command spell, all told Reynolds. Avina was the servant who had signed a contract with him. Avina is a servant. How could it be? Avina was obviously a human being. Why did she become a servant? No, it was not impossible. Could it be? Reynolds remembered a very important thing, and his face instantly tightened, and he clenched his teeth. Not knowing how many times Renault's emotions had changed in these few short seconds, Avina raised the heavy and huge shield that could hide her whole body high to block the astonishing shooting while shouting at Renault again in a shockwave. Senpai. No. Master. Please tell me what to do next. Master. The new title from the mouth of the younger generation finally made Reynolds realize the current situation. That's right. In any case, he was now a master. Moreover, the unknown enemy also launched an attack on him, trying to kill him. If he didn't find a way to solve this crisis, no matter how many things happened, he wouldn't have a chance to delve into it. Only when he got out of the current situation, he could calm down and solve all the questions. Thinking of this, Reynolds took a deep breath and let his brain work again. Then, in response to this situation, Reynolds made an instruction without hesitation. Find a place to hide first. After calming down, Reynolds' first order was something like this. It was an extremely lousy thing. However, this was the most appropriate instruction. When you are faced with long-range attacks, such as shooting and bombardment, the first thing you should do is to find cover. Reynolds raised his hand to block the incoming smoke and shouted at Avina. Don't face the archers in an open place. Let's hide behind the surrounding buildings. This instruction was naturally met with an answer. Yes. Avina did not hesitate to put down the shield, turned around fiercely, hugged Reynolds, and at the same time, Reynolds had no time to react. With an amazing speed comparable to a bullet, carrying Reynolds, who was much heavier than her in the shield, rushed to the back of a nearby building. Bam, 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 bam. Without any obstruction, the arrow pierced through the air and directly landed on the ground where Reynolds and Avina were standing a second ago. It shattered the concrete pavement and penetrated the hard rock. Like an explosion, it blasted away the asphalt road, causing it to shatter into pieces. In an instant, a strong gust of wind blew the smoke away. Cough, cough, cough. Behind the collapsed building, Renault, who was put down by Avina, couldn't help but cough. It seemed that Reynolds had inhaled a lot of dust from the impact just now. Are you all right, Senior? Avina held the shield in one hand and patted Reynolds' back with the other. Avina's worried voice, gentle actions, and clear eyes staring straight at Reynolds made Reynolds realize that no matter what had changed, Avina was still Avina. I'm fine. Reynolds shook his head and looked at Avina. As Senior, it was only then that AI Wayna seemed to realize that her outfit had become very revealing. The hand that was patting Reynolds on the back turned to block in front of her body. Her pretty face was also somewhat bashful. Looking at Avina, who shyly covered her body, Reynolds' tense face almost relaxed. At this moment, a meteor more dazzling than any of the previous shots streaked across the sky and landed on the building where they were hiding. Boom! In the violent explosion, the side of the building that received the arrows was ravaged and more than half of it was shattered. When Avina hugged Reynolds and rushed behind a building, the rain of arrows from the sky lost its target. At the top of a tall iron tower about a few kilometers away from them, a figure who was about to launch an attack stopped. You know how to find cover so quickly? A deep voice sounded from the figure's mouth. It was a man with dark skin, gray hair, and strange patterns on his face. He wore a battle suit and held a black bow tightly in his hand. It seems that the enemy has a calm commander. The dark-skinned man raised his angular face, revealing a pair of eyes full of vicissitudes and perseverance. Generally speaking, people who had such eyes were either extremely determined or extremely cold. However, this man seemed to be suitable for all of them. Unfortunately, although this judgment is correct, it's a bit hasty. The man stretched out his hand without the bow. Buzz! Amidst the buzzing sound in the air, red magic power surged in his outstretched hand like lightning. The next moment, the magical power caused a miracle and created a sword. The man put the sword on the bow. Beep! In the sound of an electric shock, the magical power surging in the sword turned into an arrow as if it was molting. The magical power on the arrow was rioting. As long as the cover is destroyed, there's nowhere to run. Under the cold declaration, the man released the bowstring in the torrent of magical power. As a result, The arrow turned into a meteor and shot toward its target in the distance with a loud bang, like the sound of a cannon. Boom! The explosion was deafening, making the tall building as if it was hit by a cannon. The side that was hit by the explosion was like a fragile building block, and most of it turned into fragments. Such a shocking impact caused the entire building to shake violently. Senpai. Behind the building, Avina rushed to Reynolds' side, raised a huge shield, and blocked the falling rubble. An astonishing amount of arm strength was displayed from Awina's body. Even the rubble that was comparable to rocks couldn't shake the shield in the slightest. When it landed on the shield, it bounced off. Involuntarily covering his head, Renaud, who was hiding under the shield, stared at Aina, who was seriously protecting him. His heart was a little complicated. Sure enough, Avina got the power and became a servant. Whether it was the defensive power used to resist the attack, the speed when rushing into the cover, or the arm strength that could withstand a rubble as heavy as a rock, it was not something that normal humans could have. Even if she used magic to strengthen her physical ability, it was extremely difficult to exert this level of power. Such a skill could give the user supervision, and it was often used in reconnaissance. If he were to look from a high vantage point, the archer would be able to recognize the entire city and search for enemies. In addition, clairvoyance also affected the accuracy of the bow. Once he set up the bow, he could snipe accurately. Thanks to clairvoyance, he could shoot from a distance with accuracy beyond the human domain. In other words, any enemy that was targeted by this pair of eyes would not be able to escape. Of course, the prerequisite was that the enemy must be within his sight. Looking at the collapsed building a few kilometers away, the archer's expression suddenly changed. He's gone. Yes, the enemy was gone. Under the collapsed building, there was no sign of the enemy. The archer couldn't help but be surprised. And at that moment, whoosh, a gust of wind came from behind the archer. Without the slightest hesitation, the archer turned around and blocked the attack with the bow in his hand. Clang! With the sound of metal clashing, a huge shield suddenly came crashing down and collided with the bow. A strong gust of wind blew. Bang! Amidst the sound, the shield and bow that collided with each other bounced off each other in the fierce wind, causing the users of both sides to explosively retreat, creating a distance between them. TSK. The archer was speechless, because he had already seen it. He didn't know when two people appeared in front of him. Are you the attacker? Aina, who was holding a shield, questioned the archer with a serious gaze and expression. She was on guard while questioning the archer. Reynolds, who was standing behind Avina, also looked at the archer and made a confirmation. Sure enough, the attacker is a servant, and the class is archer. Should I say it's expected? The only one who could do that was a servant. However, if the other party was a servant, then there was a problem. Who summoned you, and why did you attack us? You won't answer this question, right? Renaud said in a playful tone, although I already have some guesses. Reynolds' words were so clear to the other party's ears. The archer's servant suddenly became silent. What's wrong? You don't want to say anything? Reynolds said very casually, you should be a servant that was summoned through the proper way. It's impossible for you to be a defective servant like Shadow, who can't even talk, right? Reynolds teased the archer, although Reynolds said that his heart was actually full of vigilance. The other party was a real servant, not a defective servant that appeared in the simulation battle. If he was careless, he was likely to be killed. Reynolds didn't want to face another crisis. Therefore, in the case of a failed sneak attack, he could only try to stall for time and find a countermeasure that was beneficial to him. Reynolds made such a plan and induced the other party to talk to him. As long as he talked, it was possible to get information and find out what was beneficial to him. And Reynolds' provocation seemed to be somewhat effective. It really surprised me. I didn't expect to be approached to this extent while occupying the high ground. The servant named Archer glanced at Avina, who was on guard, and then turned to look at Reynolds. How did you do it? Whether it's the sky or the ground, there's nowhere to hide under my clairvoyance. It's not easy to get close. Chapter 579. Unfortunately, you're wrong. Reynolds shrugged his shoulders and said, "Since we don't need to use magic to make ourselves invisible, we don't need to use precious treasures like teleportation. We just need to use the thing under this town. Isn't that enough?" Something under the town? At first, he was stunned. Then he immediately understood. So that's the case. Is it the sewer? That's right. Behind the building, the last thing Reynolds saw was the entrance and exit of the sewer. As long as they entered the sewers and followed the sewers, they would be able to quietly approach Archer without Archer being able to see them. As for finding Archer's location, it was even easier. Although you are a few kilometers away from us, if you want to snipe us from such a distance, you must be in a high enough place. In this direction, this is the most suitable place. Reynolds' laughter solved all of Archer's questions. So, is it my turn to ask questions? Reynolds looked at Archer's direction, and his voice began to become serious. Who asked you to attack us? Who is your master? First of all, you must solve this problem. In addition, Reynolds had many questions. Among them, the most important was, what's going on in this town? Why did it become like this? Reynolds asked the most important question. The burning city turned into ruins. This was obviously an abnormal state. If Reynolds guessed correctly, he should have been transferred to 2004 by Reiko. The fire in the control room caused the first Battle of Chaldea to be aborted. However, the first Reiko transfer experiment of Chaldea had already been started. Before Reynolds left the control room had already been adjusted. So, after the control room exploded, the system detected that the experiment was terminated, and it switched from manual operation to automatic operation. It was not strange that the Reiko was transferred to the combat destination. In other words, at this moment, Reynolds was in Fuyuki City in 2004 in the Space Singularity F. After all, in the records of Chaldea, Fuyuki City did not have this fire that swept the whole town in 2004. This could only mean that there was an abnormality in this era, and it was not in the records. Something that had never happened in human history was happening. This event led to the extinction of human history. Now, Reynolds was ready to get to the bottom of this. "Don't tell me you don't want to answer," Reynolds said with a fake smile. "The current situation is in our favor. Even if the sneak attack failed, if the opponent was an archer, even if it was a servant, Aino would be able to knock it down at such a close distance. Unless you think you can win just by closing the distance?" Archer's cold voice was transmitted. The next second, Archer did something. That was to let go of the bow in his hands. Buzz! The mana surged again and turned into red lightning, gathering in Archer's hands. Then, Archer's hands gripped onto two short swords that were formed from magic and looked like bipolar daggers. Wah! Avina was shocked. There's actually a sword. Reynolds was equally shocked. His job description was obviously archer, so why did he have a sword? Even if the archer in front of him was also good at using swords when he was alive, when Archer's spirit base was summoned, he should only be allowed to use a bow. At the same time, Reynolds also understood it in a flash. As a magician, Reynolds still knew what the servant in front of him just did. Projection. Projection. It was a kind of magic that used magic to materialize an object that had existed in reality in the form of an imitation and create it. That was how the servant in front of him had a sword. In other words, the other party did not use a noble phantasm, but magic. It's your mistake to think that the archer can only use a bow. Unknown master. Nameless Archer chuckled. Then his smile turned cold. He suddenly stomped on the ground and charged forward with an astonishing momentum. Master! Avina immediately jumped in front of Reynolds, raised her shield, and was ready to fight Archer. Suddenly, the charging figure suddenly stopped and turned his head to look in a certain direction. His expression was replaced by anger. That annoying dog. After speaking in such an angry manner, Archer actually ignored Reynolds and Avina. He turned around, turned into a burst of particles, and disappeared. This, Avina was stunned. Dog? Reynolds also frowned. Only the boy and the girl were left in the iron tower. The cold wind blew, bringing the smell of smoke. A few minutes later, Reynolds and Avina had left the iron tower and returned to the burning town. It was too conspicuous to continue to stay in the Iron Tower. Reynolds could only let Avina take him away to find a temporary stronghold as fast as possible and hide in it to avoid being attacked again. That being said, the so-called stronghold was actually just one of the buildings in this ruined town. But in any case, at least the two of them had a chance to breathe. However, when they came back to their senses, the two of them looked at each other and fell into an indescribable, complicated mood. "That, are you okay, senpai?" "Well, I'm fine." Is there anything wrong with your body?" "I don't think so." That's good." Well, after a very short conversation, both of them were silent. Reynolds raised his eyes and looked at the girl in front of him, who had changed a lot. She looked awe-inspiring and somewhat uneasy. He couldn't help but sigh and took the lead to break the silence. "Anyway, let me understand the situation first." Reynolds asked Avina in a calm tone. "If I'm not wrong, Avina, you did become a servant, am I right?" That was already an irrefutable fact. Reynolds, who had already escaped from the emergency situation, had already felt something that he had ignored before. That was the faintly discernible connection between him and Avina. This connection was like an invisible channel connecting him and Avina, so Reynolds could easily send his magical power into Avina's body, and he could also order Avina through the command seal on the back of his hand. Reynolds knew very well what it meant. This meant, "You made a contract with me as a servant, didn't you?" Renaud asked this question word by word. Chapter 580. In response, Avina nodded, then shook her head and corrected herself. "I did sign a contract with Senpai, and I did get the power of servant, but I'm not a regular servant." Avina paused slightly and then said, "I'm now a subservient." When Reynolds heard that sentence, his first reaction was not surprise, but a wry smile. Sure enough, is that the case? Subservient. It wasn't a special servant, but something created by human hands. The so-called servants, although they had inhuman power and could provide amazing combat power, they were heroes, legends, and fantasies of the past. Each of them had extraordinary will and beliefs. It was a bit unrealistic to want to be a servant at will. In other words, the servant may betray the master, and it was more likely to violate the master's orders, disobey the master's command, and even harm a master. It was precisely to prevent this situation from happening that the command spell was born. The command incantation was a command that could be used 3 times. There were a total of 3 strokes, and each stroke was a command. The original intention of the command incantation was to forcibly control the servants and make them listen to the master's command. Chaldea remade this command system to cooperate with the hero spirit summoning system, so that the master who contracted with the servant could also use the command spell. However, Chaldea's command curse did not focus on the aspect of domination. Instead, it specialized in the aspect of support. Abandoning the command power, it had a miraculous effect on the servant's strengthening, healing, and other aspects. For the servant's domination, at best, it had a similar effect as a curse. Of course, if all 3 command spells were used at once, it was not impossible to force the servant to obey. Anyway, with the magical power of Chaldea, the masters could get a command charm every day, and it would take 3 days to restore the command charm. When it was time to use it, they could still use it. However, if the servant did not obey the master's command, it would cause great trouble every time. It was not good for the battle at all. In addition, the servant itself was a spirit, and its existence itself needed to consume magical power. In order to make up for various defects, Chaldea carried out an experiment. The fusion of human and hero spirit. That's right. The fusion of human and hero spirit. That was one of the research that had been carried out more than a decade ago. It was the 6th experiment of Chaldea. By fusing with the hero spirit, the experimental body can not only get the power of the servant level, but because it's not a spirit, it doesn't need to consume magical power. What's more, it can obey orders and avoid all kinds of disadvantages. That's the subservient. Reynolds looked at Avina and said bitterly, "This experiment is actually completed now. The subservient experiment started more than a decade ago, but it has not been successful so far. Reynolds did not expect that the experiment was completed under such circumstances. Avina said so. After all, I originally existed for this reason. AI Wayna's emotionless words made Reynolds clench his fists. Now that things had come to this, there was no need to say anything more. Avina was one of the subjects of that experiment. That was Avina's past, and that was her fate in life before she appeared in Chaldea 2 years ago. It wasn't until 2 years ago that she was finally liberated because of the failure of the experiment. The girl who could appear in Chaldea openly became a non-human after all. Damn it. Reynolds couldn't help but curse. After a while, Reynolds' clenched fist was held by a pair of soft hands. Please don't be so angry, Senpai. Avina gently wrapped Reynolds' clenched fist with her hands. There was also a quiet smile on her face. I don't think there's anything wrong with this. Avina's straightforward words echoed around. At least, now I have the power to protect Senpai. I feel very happy to be able to fight with Senpai as a servant of Senpai. That was definitely not a lie. The girl, named Avina, must be grateful for the current situation from the bottom of her heart. If it's me now, then I have the ability to fight. Avina smiled at Reynolds. However, the girl didn't know that her smile made Reynolds feel distressed. What do you mean by very happy? Reynolds recalled the look in Avina's eyes not long ago. In addition to the trust as always, there was something else in her eyes. That thing was called fear. On the one hand, she was happy because she got the power to fight with me. On the other hand, she was afraid of the battle itself. She was afraid of it. Reynolds held Iwena's hand, and as he exerted force, he made a decision in his heart. I will never let her face all this alone. In Chaldea, there were only 3 cases where a heroic spirit was successfully summoned. That was to say, there were already 3 servants in Chaldea, and according to Avina, the one that fused with me is heroic spirit experiment number 2. That was what Avina told Reynolds. Before I was engulfed by the fire in the control room, the hero spirit proposed a contract with me. He gave me his ability and relic as a hero spirit. In return, he hoped that I could eliminate the singularity and save humanity. It was precisely because of this that Avina got the power and became a subservient. This also made Reynolds understand. So that's how it is. Since the subject himself agreed, the experiment naturally succeeded, right? In this world, the most difficult experiment to complete was no other than the experiment that couldn't be done with cooperation. Since the subject made full cooperation, the difficulty of the experiment would naturally be reduced. So, Avina finally became a subservient. Fortunately, before the Reiki transfer, I made a contract with the predecessor. Avina said, if it wasn't because of the contract, the predecessor wouldn't be able to summon me. Perhaps the adjustment of the Reiki transfer was not completed, and there was a deviation. Reynolds and Avina were separated in the process of Reiki transfer and were transferred to different places. If Reynolds didn't use the command spell, he would have died in the hands of the unknown archer. But you can actually perform a space transfer with just a command spell. You are indeed a predecessor. Chapter 581. Avina admired Reynolds in this way. To forcibly transfer servants from different spaces, the power of a single stroke was not enough, but Reynolds made it happen. This was a very surprising thing, but it was also reasonable. The master's own ability would greatly affect the servant's strength. The higher the master's ability, the more magical power the servant could get from the master, and the more powerful the servant was. The same was true for Command Curse. If the master's ability was higher, the effect of Command Curse would be more obvious. For example, when using Command Curse, if it was an instantaneous order or a specific order, it would exert a high degree of coercion. Very clear orders such as defeat the enemy in front of you, heal your injuries, come to me, and so on, would be carried out. On the contrary, if the execution of the order was too long or too wide, the effect of Command Curse would be reduced. For example, the command, obey everything I say, was not only too long, but also too broad. If it could be implemented, then there would be no need for 3 strokes of the command incantation. It was unrealistic to think that 1 stroke of the command would be able to control the followers at will. Therefore, this command could be said to be almost useless. But there were exceptions to everything. As long as the master's quality was particularly good, even this kind of unreasonable order could have some effect. Reynolds was in such a situation. As the best master in Chaldea's record, Reynolds' ability was needless to say. In light of that, Reynolds could achieve the degree of teleportation with just 1 stroke of the command curse and summon Avina to him. Reynolds even had a feeling. Even if it's a coercive order, it seems that it can be achieved. That was the case. Originally, with the characteristics of Chaldea's command curse, if it was just a stroke, the servant should only be bound to the level of a curse. It couldn't be a coercive order. However, Reynolds felt that with his ability, even if it was just a stroke, he could still perform a coercive order through the command curse's magical power. It could be seen that Chaldea valued Reynolds so much, and it was not without reason. Reynolds, who had amazing talent in the summoning system, as a master, he could summon, control, and use his servants better than others, and it was ridiculously good. This way, with the power of the command incantation, Reynolds could even strengthen and heal Avina beyond the effects of a normal command incantation. In addition, Reynolds could also provide Avina with a large amount of mana to increase Avina's strength. This gave Reynolds some confidence. Looks like I'll have to use the remaining 2 command incantations carefully. Although Chaldea could provide magic power to restore the command incantation a day, the current situation of Chaldea was still unknown. The fire in the control room may cause abnormalities in Chaldea's system, and it may not be able to provide magic power to form a new command spell. Due to this concern, Reynolds asked Avina about the situation. This is because the magic of the servants is provided by Chaldea. If Avina could receive the magic from Chaldea, it would prove that the situation in Chaldea had not reached the worst state. If not, then it would be troublesome. Fortunately, it's okay, Senpai. I'm receiving the magic from Chaldea now, and I can fight normally. Avina reported the good news to Reynolds. In that case, the situation in Chaldea should not be too bad, but I don't know if the control room's function has returned to normal, and if the fire has been eliminated. Reynolds thought, then what should we do next? Senpai? Avina once again confirmed the plan to Reynolds. In this regard, Reynolds did not hesitate. First of all, we must find a way to get in touch with Chaldea and understand the current situation. In any case, information was a must. He had to understand the situation first before he could act. Moreover, Chaldea's support was also necessary. If it's Chaldea's radar, then we can detect and sample the surroundings with me as the center. If there are enemies approaching, we will be able to detect them. As for now, they could only rely on Reynolds. Although I don't want to waste too much magic for the next battle, every bit of magic is precious, but without Chaldea's support, this is the only way. Reynolds used bird summoning magic to summon a flock of birds and scattered them to all corners of Fuyuki City. He closed his eyes and shared his senses with the servants to explore Fuyuki City. In this regard, Avina could only rely on Reynolds, so she waited quietly. Until, Suddenly, Reynolds opened his eyes, and he was a little surprised. No, why are they here? Reynolds' shocked voice made Avina a little stunned on the spot. Senpai. Avina was a little surprised. No, it's okay, don't worry. Reynolds suddenly shook his head, and then said in an inexplicable tone, it's just we may have to greet an acquaintance. An acquaintance? Avina was even more confused. After a while, the two left that place. At the same time, in a corner of Fuyuki City, a girl was dragging her feet with a tired face, slowly walking forward. Really? What the hell is going on? The girl made a loud shout full of anxiety. There is only one person who could make such a voice that sounded like he was angry all the time. Who else could it be but Herfataya? The control room exploded inexplicably, and when I woke up, I was already in this place. No matter how I shouted, no one responded, and I couldn't even contact Chaldea. Why am I the only one who encountered this kind of bad luck? Herfataya yelled loudly, as if he wanted to vent all his resentment. Rafe, where are you? Even if it's not Rafe. If anyone hears me, respond to me quickly. I don't want to stay in this place. Come pick me up. Such an unreasonable and rude shout told others how bad Herfataya's mood was at that moment. However, Herfataya was not the only one who was here. A white object hit Herfataya's ankle unceremoniously when she stopped. It hurts. Chapter 582. Herfataya suddenly screamed in pain. Fu, the white thing also screamed. It was Fo. As if it was urging Herfataya to leave this place quickly, Fo kept bumping into Herfataya's ankle, causing Herfataya to cry out in pain. I know. I'll keep going. Don't hit me again. Herfataya could only cry out in surrender. Speaking of which, what the hell is this guy? A creature? Or a monster? Why is it here? And why is it so fierce to me? Obviously, even the director, Herfataya, had never seen Fo before. From this, it could be seen how mysterious Fo was to the people of Chaldea. Of course, Herfataya knew about it. Are you the legendary creature that has been walking in Chaldea all the time? Then you should listen to my orders. Chaldea belongs to me. Since you're staying with me, you should be obedient. It hurts. Herfataya did not have time to put up a posture, and Fo hit her knee again. She covered her knee and squatted down with tears in her eyes. Fo! Fo kept screaming at Herfataya. When Herfataya woke up, Fo came out of nowhere and urged her to rush in a direction as if it knew Herfataya. Poor Herfataya. She was a magician from a famous family, but she could not do anything to Fo. Being bullied by such a little beast was simply a disgrace. Perhaps Herfataya also had the same idea. His face was so red that he almost flipped out. Really? I've had enough. Herfataya began to wail. Fu! At this time, Fo no longer bullied Herfataya. As if it had found something, it shouted and ran forward. Seeing this, Herfataya panicked. Wait, don't leave me here alone. So, Herfataya hurriedly caught up with Fo. This flustered and timid look, if the staff in Chaldea saw it, they would definitely hold their stomachs and laugh. But it had to be said that this was the real Herfataya. As the daughter of a famous magic family, Herfataya was also of the aristocratic school. She was arrogant and self-righteous. Due to the pressure of work, her temper was also quite irritable. However, she was still a dishonest young lady who valued the people around her. She did not like to owe others favors. She would repay kindness, but she also liked to flaunt her superiority. Moreover, she was quite fragile and easily defeated. She was also somewhat timid. After all, in essence, Herfataya was only in her 20s. Letting such a young girl in her 20s take charge of the management of the entire Chaldea and carrying too much expectation from her family, it was natural for her to become like this. She was irritable and overly aware of everything, resulting in an overreaction. There were many people in Chaldea who knew about this. Many people knew that Herfataya was just trying to be brave. Now, since there were no outsiders, Herfataya could no longer put on a brave front. He showed his true self to the fullest. Therefore, how shameful. Where did that arrogant attitude of yours go? What a shame. Where did it all go? When such a mocking voice came into Herfataya's ears, Herfataya's panicked figure froze in place. Fo! At the same time, Fo jumped into the arms of a girl with a pleasant cry. Fo! So you came with us? The girl with the giant shield was surprised. She hugged Fo, who jumped towards her. Next to her, a young man in a Chaldea uniform looked at Herfataya with a smile. Ro! Lorelei! Suddenly, Herfataya became a little embarrassed. Oh, great director, it seems that you're living a good life, Reynolds said with a mischievous smile. This made Herfataya's mood suddenly fall to the bottom. Bad. It's really bad. It was not someone else, but this man saw such an embarrassing side. It was really bad. Why? Why are you here? Herfataya was angry on the spot. Of course, what made Herfataya angry was Avina's appearance. What's the matter with you? Avina. Herfataya was shocked. The amazing magical fluctuations from Avina's body told Herfataya that the girl in front of him had been reborn. And the reason for this, Herfataya could only think of one. That was why Herfataya had such a performance. In this regard, the sarcasm on Reynolds's face became more and more obvious. You are the director of Chaldea. How can you not guess the good things that Chaldea has done? When Reynolds said this, he didn't show any mercy at all. This made Herfataya's lips tremble a few times. In the end, he could not say a word. Senior. Avina pulled Reynolds's sleeve and shook her head at him. Umph. Reynolds snorted coldly. He did not compromise, but he did not say anything more. After all, it was the former director, Herfataya's father, who used Avina as an experimental subject, not Herfataya himself. Herfataya inherited Chaldea and became the director of Chaldea. In fact, it was only a few years ago. In this regard, Herfataya did not seem to intend to shirk his responsibility. He just tried to speak calmly with a pale face. In short, explain it to me first. In this way, a group of 3 people and 1 beast left together and entered a building. Subservient. A few minutes later, Herfataya learned the whole story from Avina. As if he expected it, he felt inexplicable anxiety, biting his nails and moaning. Why did it take until this time? Herfataya's whisper was full of chagrin. Whether it was because the 6th experiment of Chaldea had been carried out too quickly, or because it had been carried out too late, no one knew. But the fact that Herfataya's delicate body was slightly trembling, whether it was Reynolds or Avina, they could still see it. It was just that no one knew what Herfataya's mood was now. In the end, this girl was angry with the appearance of this inhuman experiment again, or afraid of something else. Chapter 583. Of course, Herfataya was not the only one with a problem. Reynolds also had a problem. The fact that Avina became a subservient really surprised me for a long time, but you actually appeared here, which also surprised me. Renaud glanced at Herfataya and said bluntly, "Why did this happen? It's impossible for you to appear here, isn't it?" This sentence just poked Herfataya's sore spot. But this was the truth. Logically speaking, it was impossible for Herfataya to appear here. Although you are a first-class magician, and your magic aptitude is also very high, you don't have the fitness to be a master, and you don't have the fitness to be a reaper. Reynolds exposed this problem. This was the problem. Herfataya didn't have the fitness to be a reaper. Therefore, Herfataya was not a suitable candidate for the position of master, and he did not have any plans to carry out the psychic transfer experiment. As a result, it was unreasonable for Herfataya to appear here. Not to mention that there was no fitness. Reaper transfer was impossible to succeed. Even if it succeeded, if Herfataya was not on the list of Chaldea's Reaper transfer, then even if the system switched to automatic operation, it would not transfer Reaper to Fuyuki City. Under such circumstances, why would Herfataya appear in Fuyuki City in 2004? This was Reynolds' question. It's just, I don't know what's going on. Herfataya said very irritably, I originally planned to stay in Chaldea, and I didn't want to come to this place at all, but the control room suddenly exploded inexplicably, and everything in front of me was engulfed in flames. I almost lost consciousness in the first moment, and when I woke up again, I was already here. In other words, Herfataya himself was also inexplicable. Is there a problem with the Reaper transfer experiment? Or is there an unknown reason for all this? Who can tell me what's going on? Herfataya groaned as if he had a headache. At this time, where did Lev go? If it was the professor, he should be able to give a reasonable explanation for this situation, right? Unfortunately, perhaps the reason lies with that professor, idiot. Reynolds looked at Herfataya, who was holding his head and groaning. As he muttered this in his heart, he felt extremely uncomfortable, as if he had been pricked by a thorn. In the end, the mystery of why the control room in Chaldea exploded and why the professor disappeared before the battle began has not been solved. Recalling the chill he felt from Lev, Reynolds couldn't wait to drag this guy out. Intuition told Reynolds that Rafe must be hiding some big secret. If not for this, Reynolds would not have rushed out of the control room because of Lev's disappearance before the start of an important battle. The reason was to get rid of this feeling of being stuck in his throat. That being said, Reynolds already had a rough idea of where the professor was. Therefore, Reynolds could not help but turn his head and look in a direction through the broken window. In that direction, there was a deep mountain. If I'm not wrong, Renaud was thinking about this in his heart. He turned his head and looked at Helfatiah. That's right, Chief Idiot. Idiot. Chief Idiot. Reynolds blurted out the name, which made Helfatiah's forehead burst with blue veins. But Reynolds ignored Helfatiah's reaction and continued to speak as if nothing happened. Since you are the chief of Chaldea, you should know how to contact Chaldea in an emergency, right? For this purpose, Reynolds rushed over with Avina to find Helfatiah. Otherwise, Reynolds really wanted to let this proud and arrogant director suffer more and wait until she couldn't take it anymore before appearing. Helfatiah didn't know Reynolds' intention. He just snorted and answered Reynolds' question. I can directly connect to Chaldea's communication channel with the authority of the chief, but it has to be done through the communicator. Hearing this, Reynolds cast his eyes on Helfatiah's wrist. There was no Chaldea's custom-made communicator there. Did the control room malfunction when it exploded? Or did it disappear in the abnormal Reiki transfer? No matter what the reason was, it seemed that this was the reason why Helfatiah couldn't get in touch with Chaldea and was reduced to the fate of running away with foe. My communicator also disappeared after I became a subservient. Avina, who was holding a shield and letting foe stand on her shoulder, looked at Reynolds. It seems that among us, only the predecessor still has a communicator. Avina's words led everyone's attention to Reynolds' wrist. There was indeed a Chaldea's communicator there. In fact, from the beginning, Reynolds had been trying to contact Chaldea through the communicator, but he failed. Since you have a special means of communication, then I'll give you the communicator. With that said, Reynolds simply took off the watch-type communicator on his wrist and threw it to Helfatiah. You be careful. This is the only means of communication we have at the moment. Helfatiah hurriedly caught the communicator. While complaining, he quickly operated the communicator. After a while, Helfatiah gave up. No, I can't contact them. Helfatiah shook his head and said, although I entered the communication channel, no one on the other side of Chaldea answered. Thinking about it carefully, this was normal. There was such a big fire in the control room, and even the central area was blocked. Before the abnormal disaster was eliminated, no one could enter the central control room and pick up the communication here. I don't know what happened to my brother. Thinking of this, Reynolds was a little worried. However, now was not the time to worry about others. Chirp, chirp, chirp. A bird suddenly flew in from the window, hovered over Reynolds' head, and made an alarm-like cry. This is... Reynolds' face changed. Whoa! At the same time, Foe also made a warning sound on Avina's back. What happened? Helfatiah was a little panicked. On the other hand, AI Wayna had already raised her shield and stood in front of everyone. At this moment, roar, 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 roar. An intimidating roar resounded through the air. Chapter 584. When such a roar appeared in this space and reached the ears of Renaud, Townsend, and Helfatiah, the three of them shuddered at the same time. What is that? Helfatiah's face turned extremely pale. Oh! Townsend clenched his hand that was holding the shield so tightly that his fingertips turned white. Cold sweat also dripped down Reynolds' forehead. From this sound, everyone could hear a violent feeling that was enough to make their hearts stop, their body temperature drop, and even their blood flow stop. Then, a terrifying sense of crisis welled up in everyone's hearts. The next second, they're here. Townsend let out a loud cry. Boom! Almost at the same time, one of the walls in the building where everyone was hiding shattered on the spot, turning into fragments in the blast and blowing around. Ya! Helfatiah let out a shrill cry. Reynolds stared straight ahead and saw a figure slowly walking in from the shattered wall. It was a man who was more than 2 meters tall. His muscles were knotted together, and he was very strong. He wore a battle skirt and held a stone axe with a jagged section. His upper body was bare, and his feet were bare. His entire body was covered in pitch-black lines. Roar, 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 roar. Ju-Han let out a roar that was enough to shake the air, and the roar turned into a sound wave that blew out. Townsend stood in front of everyone with a giant shield in his hand, blocking the sound wave for everyone. It's a lie, right? Helfatiah retreated step by step, looking at Ju-Khan, who was like a fierce god. His face was full of fear. Seriously, this is too much of a joke. Reynolds' expression also became extremely strained. Reynolds felt a terrifying pressure from the man's body that even the one who attacked him didn't have. Obviously, the other party was a servant. Judging from his irrational appearance, there should be no doubt about it. It's a job only suitable for heroic spirits who had fallen into madness when they were alive. The servant who got this job would have the berserk skill, which would be strengthened in exchange for the loss of rationality. It was originally a class that was used to strengthen weak servants. But the servant in front of him was a far cry from the word weak. That's undoubtedly one of the top servants. Even among all the heroic spirits, it was enough to be ranked first. Now, the other party had used his job to enter the mortal realm, and at the cost of losing his rationality, he had been strengthened. She was already a top-level servant, and she was strengthened. Now, Reynolds and the others were facing such an enemy. Thus, Reynolds understood. Compared to the previous one, this servant is not at the same level. When they faced each other, Reynolds was almost defeated even though he had the advantage, not to mention facing this monster. Therefore, Renault only had one thought. Run! Renault's voice resounded. That's not someone we can deal with right now. Take advantage of his madness to escape. Run as far as you can. Neither Townsend nor Helfatiah objected to Renault's decision. At that moment, whether it was Renault, Townsend, or Helfatiah, they all turned around and ran without hesitation. Roar! He immediately let out an angry roar and chased after him. Boom! In a corner of the burning city, the side wall of a building suddenly burst, turning the rubble into bullets, scraping in all directions. Townsend, who was holding a cross shield, flew out from the broken wall. His face was full of horror and pain. Roar! With a terrifying roar, he rushed at a terrifying speed. Obviously, his body was very large, but his movements were as agile as a cheetah. While flying toward Townsend, he swung the stone axe in his hand and slashed down on Townsend's body. Clang! In the terrible knocking sound, the stone axe that fell on the shield burst out with a terrifying force, causing the impact to explode on the shield, setting off a shock wave. Guh! Woo! After blocking the blow, Townsend uttered a muffled groan. His slender body couldn't resist the amazing force of a shield. He was sent flying by the shock wave and crashed into a building behind him, smashing the wall of the building into pieces. Townsend, Reynolds, who ran out of the building, saw this scene and could not help but call out, "What a monster!" Helfatiah also ran out. His face was extremely pale. Roar! At this time, the one with the stone axe turned around and looked at Reynolds and Helfatiah. Huh! Reynolds and Helfatiah felt their scalps tingling at the same time and stepped back. Hiya! At this time, Townsend's delicate voice sounded. He held the shield and jumped out from the shattered wall. His whole body turned into a cannonball, setting off a strong wind, and launched a charge. In the sound of boom, the charging Townsend was blocked. Roar! He continued to roar, looking like he had lost his mind, but the posture of holding the stone axe and blocking Townsend's shield was obviously well practiced. Needless to say, this servant did not lose his fighting skills because of losing his mind. It was simply a foul. Now, Townsend restrained the weapon and shouted at Reynolds and Helfatiah from behind the shield. The two of them reacted. Let's go. Reynolds abandoned the reluctance in his heart, took Helfatiah's hand, and ran in the other direction. Wait. What about Townsend? At this time, it was Helfatiah who was worried about Townsend. Townsend will be fine. Reynolds threw out such an answer without any doubt, dragged Helfatiah, and ran forward desperately. Foe had also landed on the ground, leading the way, and also ran. 2 people and 1 beast ran into the depths of the city, just to get away from the disaster behind them. However, at this time, there was a new problem. Reynolds, who was physically exhausted, gradually gasped for breath. You are still the same as before. Your stamina is not good at all. Herfataya smacked his lips and, in turn, dragged Reynolds and ran forward. However, Herfataya was also a girl, and her stamina was not much better. Comparing stamina with a servant is a stupid thing to do. Seeing that both of them began to slow down, Reynolds did not hesitate to activate the magic circuit. Wolf summon. 2 sturdy black wolves were summoned. Chapter 585. Quick, sit on it. Reynolds pushed the helpless Helfataya onto one of the wolves, and he sat on the other one, and then drove the 2 wolves and began to run forward. Ha! Roar! Behind him, Townsend's voice and the enemy's roar were still ringing. Reynolds listened to the voice and pressed the command seal on the back of his hand. Once out of the battlefield, Reynolds would not hesitate to use the command seal to summon Townsend back. With such an idea, Reynolds drove the wolf familiar and ran forward. Is that guy's servant? Holding the black wolf under him tightly, Helfataya, who escaped from the battlefield with the black wolf, shouted at Reynolds. Why is there a servant here? It was no wonder that Helfataya had such a question. Even Chaldea only succeeded in summoning servants 3 times. It was not normal for a servant to appear in Fuyuki City in 2004. In the face of Helfataya's question, Reynolds just twitched his mouth. Didn't I say that after being transferred by Ryo, we were immediately attacked by servants? This sentence was met with Helfataya's wrath. You didn't say that. Helfataya shouted angrily. Although Townsend told Helfataya the reason why she became a subservient, and also said that the 2 of them were attacked, she did not say that the one who attacked her was a servant. In this regard, Reynolds only had 1 sentence. Even if I didn't say it, haven't you guessed it? Reynolds did not look at Helfataya. He just drove the familiar and said, that's the product of the Holy Grail War. This sentence made Helfataya's eyes widen. The Holy Grail War. It was an extremely rare ritual in the magic world. It was called a miracle that was comparable to magic. The purpose of the ritual was to get the Holy Grail. It was a wish-granting machine that could fulfill the wishes of the holder and had amazing magical power. The so-called Holy Grail War was a battle that revolved around this wish-granting machine that could fulfill the wishes of the holder. In this battle, there would be 7 masters participating in the battle, and with the power of the ritual, 7 heroes with different professions would be summoned from the Seat of Heroes. When there was only 1 master and 1 servant left, the wish-granting machine, called the Holy Grail, would descend, allowing the holder to rely on its magical power to achieve a miracle that could not be achieved by humans. This matter was not considered a secret in the world of magic. Many famous families knew the existence of this ritual, and they knew the preciousness of the Holy Grail, so they coveted it. And Fuyuki City was the birthplace of the Holy Grail War. In view of this, when Helfataya mentioned that the singularity was in Fuyuki City in 2004, many magicians from the famous families had a reaction. Because, according to the records of Chaldea, in 2004, Fuyuki City was indeed hosting a Holy Grail War. Helfataya said with an ashen face. Could it be that these servants were summoned in the Holy Grail War in Fuyuki City? Because of this, servants that did not belong to Chaldea would appear in this town. Because of this, Renault was attacked. They thought I was a master who participated in the Holy Grail War, right? Renault solved the mystery. In order to obtain the Holy Grail, there were 7 masters and 7 servants fighting each other. In such a situation, some servants regarded Renault and Townsend as enemies who also participated in the Holy Grail War, so it was not difficult to lead to an attack. After Ryo moved to this era and suffered an unknown attack, Reynolds had such a guess after learning that the other party was a servant. Therefore, Reynolds was not surprised at all that there was a servant in Fuyuki City and even attacked him. If the Holy Grail War is still going on in Fuyuki City, then it's not surprising that there are servants here. Renault knew a lot about the Holy Grail War, because the Holy Grail was a well-known miracle that could fulfill the wish of the holder. The boy who cherished miracles accidentally found its records in the Chaldea library a few years ago and had a great interest in it. Thanks to this, Renault had a very high understanding of the Holy Grail War. Even Townsend learned about the existence of the Holy Grail War from Renault. As for Helfatia, his understanding of the Holy Grail War was no less than Renault. I didn't expect that Chaldea would actually summon servants from the Holy Grail War in Fuyuki City. Helfatia was speechless. Perhaps others didn't know? In fact, Chaldea's heroic spirit summoning system was originally based on the Holy Grail War in Fuyuki City. Fuyuki City was the birthplace of the Holy Grail War, and it was also the birthplace of the heroic spirit summoning system. Before that, people usually could only summon part of the heroic spirit's power by means of esoteric magic. Summoning and using the heroic spirit as a servant had almost become an extravagant hope in modern times. It wasn't until the Holy Grail War in Fuyuki City that people quietly understood the heroic spirit summoning system. Chaldea's destiny was based on the Fuyuki City's summoning system. Thinking of this, Helfatia changed his mood. Since that monster is a servant summoned in the Holy Grail War, it should have a master, right? Helfatia quickly said, while Townsend is holding it, let's find the master. There was no doubt that they couldn't defeat that monster. That monster was a top-level servant. On the other hand, although Townsend got the power of a servant, he was just a nouveau riche. He had no experience in fighting with a servant directly. Coupled with his personality, it was impossible for him to defeat that monster. If it wasn't because Townsend specialized in defense and his weapon was a shield, even if he couldn't defeat the opponent, he could block the opponent's attack. Perhaps, with Townsend's strength, he couldn't even hold that monster. In this way, they could only start with a master. As long as the master is defeated, the servant can no longer continue to fight. Helfatia could only choose this method. After all, the servant didn't belong to this world. Its essence was a spiritual body. It needed to rely on the contract between the servant and the master to continue to survive. Therefore, as long as the other party's master was defeated, unless the other party had special skills, they could only disappear. Unfortunately, that won't work. Renault poured a bucket of cold water and said, if I'm not mistaken, the other party doesn't have a master at all. Chapter 586. No master. Helfatia was stunned. But that was what Reynolds thought. Haven't you noticed that since we came to this town, we haven't even found a single person? Reynolds said, I also sent a flock of tamed birds to explore the town, but they didn't even find a single person. In other words, there was no living person in Fuyuki City. I'm afraid that something unusual happened in this Holy Grail War, which led to the destruction of Fuyuki City and the disappearance of all human beings, which led to the extinction of human history. Reynolds guessed. Reynolds still didn't know what the anomaly was. But the appearance of this anomaly should have changed the meaning of the Holy Grail War, and the servants also became special existences that could continue to move without a master. Then what should we do? Helfatia was at his wit's end. Don't be noisy. Let me think. Reynolds glared at Helfatia, and his mind was spinning rapidly. Reynolds estimated that the chance of defeating that servant was less than 10% with their current combat power. Reynolds quickly calculated various battle situations in his mind. Reynolds, who was very clear about his position, had always been very self-aware. He knew that he was a master, and his duty was to command and support, not to personally go to the front line to fight. Therefore, aside from the magic that could only summon low-level tame monsters, the 3 kinds of middle-level tame monsters that he could summon were carefully selected from many kinds of tame monsters. After all, unlike low-level tame monsters that could only be compared with ordinary beasts, middle-level tame monsters already had a certain degree of special ability. For example, the demonic ants summoned by the demonic ant summoning, In addition to being as big as a dog, they had extraordinary strength. Even an elephant could be lifted up by themselves. If comparing strength, even some high-level tame monsters couldn't be compared with a demonic ant. They could come in handy in many situations. Of course, Reynolds liked these demonic ants. In addition to their amazing strength, there was another reason. That was, the price-performance ratio was quite high. This so-called price-performance ratio was reflected in the consumption of magical power. This was because ants were very social creatures to begin with. After learning the demonic ant summoning, Reynolds found out that the demonic ants won by numbers. If he were to summon a mid-level familiar of any other species, the amount of magic power required would be enough to summon 10 demonic ants. The reason why Reynolds was interested in the demonic ant summoning technique and learned it was because he could summon a large number of them. Enough ants can kill an elephant. If you exhaust all your magic power and summon hundreds of demonic ants, then with some tactics and countermeasures, it's not impossible for you to kill a high-level familiar. Therefore, the first mid-level familiar that Reynolds learned to summon was the demonic ant. However, the second and third types of mid-level familiars were different. Apart from the demonic ants, the other two types of intermediate demonic servants that Reynolds could summon did not possess combat abilities, but rather focused on other aspects. One of them was used by Reynolds to protect himself. As a summoning magician, the first thing you need to consider is to protect yourself. After all, magicians who were good at summoning spells were a weakness. If the enemy didn't care about the tamed demons and only attacked the summoner, then once the summoner was defeated, it didn't matter how many tamed demons there were or how strong they were. Therefore, although the second type of intermediate demonic servant that Reynolds could summon had no combat ability, it had a good defensive ability. In some situations, it might even be more useful than Townsend. As for the third type of intermediate demonic servant, it was a type of tamed demon that had a certain restraint on servants. That was because Reynolds was very clear about it. As a master, I will definitely have to deal with servants in the future. On the journey of humanity's salvation, humans were often insignificant. Only those heroic spirits that existed in legends and fantasies were indispensable guardians for the era. The existence of heroic spirits was the world's defense mechanism, a weapon used to protect the world. Since that was the case, if he wanted to interfere with human reasoning and travel through all the eras, it would be unavoidable to come into contact with the servants and even fight with them. Therefore, the third type of intermediate demonic servant that Reynolds could summon had a certain degree of restraint on servants. To be more precise, it should be said that it had a certain degree of restraint on spirits. If he used that intermediate demonic servant, even if he faced that monster, he should still have a 10% chance of winning. However, the magical power needed to summon that intermediate demonic servant was not ordinary. Should he use it here? On the bumpy back of the wolf, Reynolds tried to stabilize his body while racking his brains. At that moment, boom! With a loud noise from behind, the shock waves scraped the asphalt road, shattering the glass of the buildings on both sides of the road. It was like a typhoon passing through, setting off bursts of explosions. A figure flew out from the blast like a cannonball. In an instant, it caught up with Renaud and Herfataya, who were bouncing on the wolf's back. With a strong gust of wind, it crashed into the ground not far in front of Renaud. At the same time, the ground was smashed, and smoke and dust rose like a mushroom. Cough, cough, cough. Townsend, who was holding a shield, stood up shakily from the smoke and dust. It seemed that he had suffered a lot of damage. Townsend! Herfataya exclaimed subconsciously. Even Reynolds almost screamed, but he tried his best to suppress it. Behind them, extreme violence was approaching an extremely fast speed. The giant jumped from midair like a meteorite, crossing a distance of nearly a kilometer in an instant, and landed in front of Reynolds and Herfataya, who were running wildly. "Senior!" Townsend cried out. But before that, Reynolds had already ordered the demonic servant he was controlling. Dodge! There was no pause at all. Under the guidance of Reynolds' magical power, the two wolves each howled and dodged to the left and right respectively. The burly giant landed heavily in the position of Reynolds and Herfataya, who were separated to the left and right. Next, it was the explosion. With a boom, the impact was set off in the blast, causing debris, gravel, and concrete to fly up together, causing the ground to tremble. The force of the impact blew the two people riding on the wolf into the air. They tumbled to the ground and rolled for a distance. Ugh! Herfataya seemed to have become dizzy under the impact. He was unable to get up from the ground for a long time. On the contrary, Reynolds had already expected this situation. At the critical moment, he let the demonic servant cushion his body to avoid a direct impact. Chapter 587. The poor wolf lost its consciousness after running for such a long time and being used as a scapegoat by Reynolds. Only then did Reynolds crawl up from the ground, panting as he looked ahead. Its huge figure was right between Renaud and Townsend. Renaud and Townsend looked at the servant at the same time. Their eyes met across the burly figure. Their gazes instantly revealed a sense of determination. "There's no other way." Reynolds wiped the sweat from his forehead, and a fearless smile appeared on his face. Regarding this, Townsend also understood tacitly, and his face tensed up. "Then, get ready." "Townsend." "Yes." Magical power surged from their bodies and went straight to the sky. Just as Renaud and AI Wayna were about to use all their strength to directly confront the enemy that was difficult to defeat, on the rooftop of a tall building, a dark-skinned, white-haired man wearing a battle suit was actually looking at this scene from a few kilometers away. It was Altair. As the battle started, Altair, who saw the scene with his clairvoyance, showed a cold expression. The opponent is Mad God. Not to mention me, even that one will find it difficult to deal with him. You have zero chance of winning. Altair's statement was inconsistent with Reynolds' own calculation. That was because compared to Reynolds, Altair knew more about Mad God, and he knew that Mad God's true strength was not only his amazing combat power. In addition, there was another reason why Altair asserted that Reynolds had no chance of winning. That was himself. The opponent is not one person, but two. Altair's magical power burst out of his hand like red lightning, and he made a bow. It was obvious that this archer was preparing to make a move in the dark while Reynolds and his men were fighting with Blake. That was undoubtedly a behavior that was extremely inconsistent with the existence of a hero. But the archer didn't care at all. As long as I can complete the task, whether it's assassination or poisoning, I will do it. With that belief, Altair raised his bow. It was just, the exciting part is just about to start. You guys should just stand aside and watch. That was a very unrestrained voice, but there was an indescribable charm to it. Along with the voice, a red light flashed on the rooftop. It was the glow of a scorching fireball. The ball of flame with high temperature suddenly appeared and pierced through the air, shooting toward Altair. Altair's expression immediately changed. Without hesitation, he dodged to the side like a sharp arrow. The fireball brushed past where Altair was a second ago and landed on the edge of the rooftop. Boom! The sound of an explosion rang out, causing scorching waves of fire to blow away, causing waves of impact, burning a corner of the rooftop. With that kind of power, even a servant wouldn't be able to bear the consequences if they were hit directly. Altair's expression turned ugly as he looked in the direction of the attack. On the windy rooftop, another person had appeared out of nowhere. Ah, as expected, sneak attacks aren't my style, so it's impossible to succeed. The man scratched his head as he complained. He was wearing a coat that made him look like a sage. He held a wooden wand in his hand. His hair color was an impressive dark blue. His appearance seemed to be about the same age as Altair, but he seemed to be a little older than Altair, exuding a wild feeling. Looking at this person, Altair narrowed his eyes. You actually ran out by yourself, Chalster. That person was Chalster's servant. Obviously, you relied on that kind of sneak attack to solve the problem one after another. Now you say that sneak attacks are not your style. It's ridiculous. Altair made merciless sarcasm to Chalster. In this regard, Chalster didn't care. It's just a matter of preference. Rather than hiding, I prefer to face my opponent head-on. But if there's really no other way and I have to do this, I'll do it. You should be the same, right? Nameless Altair? Chalster's casual tone made people have a good impression of him. However, Altair didn't feel that way at all. Instead, he released hostility toward Chalster. Are you going to mess with me again? Hound! Altair's hostility was obvious. This made Chalster laugh in spite of himself. Isn't it just a sneak attack on Saber's nest when you weren't there? You still hold a grudge? As expected of that guy's believer. If this sentence was heard by Reynolds, he would understand, right? Previously, when Reynolds faced Altair, Altair suddenly retreated without any warning, which really made Reynolds somewhat puzzled. But now, it seemed that Altair's retreat had a lot to do with Chalster's actions. Obviously, the Holy Grail War is a competition where all the masters and servants fight each other. Now, all the masters have disappeared, and you are standing in the same camp with another servant who should be an enemy. The rest of the servants are all crazy. It's all unpleasant. Chalster looked at Altair with a slight grin on his face. Now, finally, someone who can break this unpleasant situation has come. Don't mess it up again. Having said that, Chalster didn't wait for Altair to respond. He changed the topic and said something that made Altair's eyes narrow. By the way, in order to deal with those brats, you lured Blake out and used it to cause trouble for the other side. I have already dealt with Lancer. This news made Altair look at Chalster with a little murderous intent in his eyes. He didn't expect to be bitten again by this unpleasant dog in front of him. Facing Altair's murderous intent, Chalster laughed. Who told you to be distracted after those brats came here? Of course, you can't not seize this rare opportunity. Idiot. Chalster raised the staff in his hand and pointed it at Altair. His gaze on Altair became full of fighting spirit. As long as 6 servants are defeated, and I am the only one left, this Holy Grail War will be over, right? It's not easy to see a little hope. Don't mess it up again. Archers, come. Charles did not hide his intentions in the slightest, and it caused Altair's expression to darken. Chapter 588. Then, Altair sneered. Do you think it's possible to defeat Blake with those guys alone? Hearing that, Chalster raised his eyebrows. Only this question, Chalster really couldn't say for sure. However, the smile on Chalster's face did not disappear. If it's a hand-to-hand battle, that mad god alone can overpower the other 6 servants in the Holy Grail War. In this Fuyuki city, only Saber can defeat him, and she has to release her noble phantasm to do so. Those brats shouldn't be able to defeat Blake, right? Chalster said, and his smile became extremely arrogant. But how do you know if you don't try? For this reason, Chalster appeared here. As long as you don't mess things up. Chalster's purpose was to contain Altair here. If possible, Chalster would definitely want to kill Altair. Therefore, Altair knew that he could no longer be distracted by dealing with Renault. Otherwise, this guy would definitely make a move on him when he was distracted. Altair's face darkened, and he finally snorted, turned into a burst of particles, and disappeared. Seeing this, Chalster heaved a sigh of relief and shrugged. Fortunately, this guy is very cautious. Otherwise, my chances of winning won't be high. After all, in order to defeat Lancer's servant, Chalster consumed a lot of energy and suffered a lot of damage. Next, Chalster turned his head and looked at the other side of the battlefield. Don't let me down. I don't know where this master came from. The crisp sound symbolized the start of a fierce battle, and it rippled like an echo. That was the sound of the axe sword that was as heavy as a rock and as sinister as a saw. It was as if it had been struck by lightning. Amidst the buzzing sounds in the air, it heavily landed on the enormous shield. Ugh! AI Wayna raised her shield and felt the terrifying impact from the shield. She didn't know how many times she let out a muffled groan. The soles of her feet were also rubbed back under the impact of the impact. It was as if she had plowed the ground and stepped on it, leaving deep footprints. Roar, 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 roar. The servant named Blake was making the same whistling sound. His eyes were glowing red, and the axe in his hand was like a storm, constantly swinging in the direction of Avina. For a moment, The strong wind stirred up by the axe and sword was like a meat grinder in action. As it whistled, it turned into a violent storm, falling one by one onto Avena's shield. Clang, 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 clang. A bell-like sound rang out incessantly, causing sparks to burst out from the place where the axe, sword, and shield collided. It also caused the impact to turn into a substantial force, stirring up the atmosphere and shattering the surrounding earth. Blake mercilessly launched a deadly attack on Avina. Avina held on bitterly. She clenched her teeth and steadied her trembling heart and arms. It was as if she was declaring to her enemy that she would never retreat again. She took on all of Blake's storm-like attacks head-on. Avina also did the same thing when she restrained Blake, allowing Renaud, Olga, and Mary to escape. As a result, under Blake's astonishing strength, Avina could only retreat step by step. She couldn't even hold on for a long time and could only be sent flying by Blake. But now Haya, AI Wayna, let out a clear and delicate cry. Not long ago, she couldn't withstand many heavy attacks, but this time, not only was Avina blocked all of them, but also bounced off Avena's shield. Bang! Amidst the muffled sound, Avina held the shield, and while bouncing off the axe and sword, her whole body fiercely hit Blake's body. The shield was like an iron hammer, hitting Blake's chest. Avina not only blocked all of the attacks, but also counterattacked. Compared to her previous appearance where she couldn't resist at all, it was like heaven and earth. That was to be expected. Earlier, Avina was only fighting alone. Naturally, she wasn't Blake's match. But this time, Avina was not alone. Now, when Reynolds, who was at the back, saw this, his eyes immediately lit up. At this moment, if someone could see the magic circuits in Reynolds' body, they would definitely find that the magic circuits that were like intricate circuit diagrams were now operating at a high speed, causing mana to flow continuously like electric currents. Thanks to this, a huge amount of magical power flowed from Reynolds' body into Avina's body through the channel established by the contract. Not only that, but Reynolds also decisively used the second command incantation at the start of the battle. This was Reynolds' order to Avina. Under this command, the second command incantation burned on the back of Reynolds' hand, turning in a surging magical power that also flowed into Avina's body. With the dual magical support from Reynolds and the command incantation, Avina's strength almost exploded. Not only did she block Blake's attack, but she also seized the opportunity to counterattack. Roar! Blake let out a roar that sounded like anger and madness. It was impossible not to be angry, because with Blake's strength, even if Avina received the magical support from Reynolds and the command incantation, her lack of battle experience would still make it impossible for Avina to be Blake's opponent. Even if Blake had lost his rationality, his battle techniques were still deeply etched in his body that had been tempered thousands of times. In view of this, Avina's direct attack, that was not fancy and without any trace of technique, shouldn't have been able to hit Blake. However, from the beginning, Blake's movements seemed to be somewhat disorderly. That terrifying storm-like attack, at a certain moment, would suddenly go against Blake's will, and there would be an imperceptible pause. That unexpectedly agile body, at a certain moment, would suddenly twitch and stagnate on the spot. Under such an inexplicable influence, Blake's attacks were still violent and terrifying, but after a period of time, there would definitely be a flaw. This flaw became what AI Wayna relied on to come back from the dead. So, after 3 seconds, attack from the left. Yes, master. Under Reynolds' loud command, Avina also responded loudly and carried out Reynolds' command meticulously. Chapter 589. 3 seconds later, Blake's axe and sword paused for a moment, and his body twitched again. Avina, who was acting according to Reynolds' orders, seized the opportunity to raise her shield and collide head-on. Bang! After an unknown number of dull thuds, the heavy shield finally forced Blake to retreat. Roar! Blake couldn't stand his retreat and went berserk. Next to them, Olga Marie, who had just struggled to get up, was completely stunned by this scene. Reynolds, under Olga Marie's gaze, continued to give orders and sent large amounts of magical power to support Avina, so that Avina could fight against a monster she thought she couldn't defeat. Seeing the battle becoming more and more intense, Olga Marie's heart trembled. Olga Marie knew that the one who caused the situation was no one else but Reynolds. How did he do it? Even with a large amount of magical power, even with the command spell strengthening, it was still impossible to defeat Blake. However, Reynolds had done something to interfere with Blake's actions, causing Blake to repeatedly reveal flaws. Furthermore, he had coordinated with these flaws to give the most precise instructions to Iwina so that the battle would not be one-sided. If that's the case, maybe he can win? Olga Marie couldn't help but have some hope. Unfortunately, Olga Marie didn't notice this at all. Reynolds' face was gradually turning pale. Magical power. Reynolds felt the magical power in his body rapidly flowing away, supporting his tottering body. In order to defeat the strong enemy in front of him, Reynolds not only sent large amounts of magical power to strengthen Avina, but also summoned his trump card, the Familiar. Reynolds could only clench his teeth. Devil Summoning. An owl that only Reynolds could see, like a phantom, flapped its wings, flew forward, and entered Blake's body. At this moment, the spirit core in Blake's body began to tremble. One of the 3 magic spells that Reynolds learned that can summon an intermediate familiar. As the name suggests, this magic spell can summon a kind of evil spirit. This kind of evil spirit was the owl. In ancient times, the owl that only appeared at night was often regarded as a bird of bad luck, a symbol of bad omen. It was generally believed that the owl was Azrael's incarnation that could travel between the underworld and the human world, responsible for bringing the wandering spirits back to the underworld. The owl that was summoned by devil summoning was this kind of evil spirit that symbolized bad omen. The evil spirit's ability, as recorded in the legend, could bring the spirits back to the underworld. In other words, it could restrain the spirits, remove the spirits from the human world by devouring them, and dispel their power in the human world. In the beginning, after Reynolds learned about it, he didn't hesitate to make it one of the magic spells he must learn. It took him about half a year to master it completely. He summoned the owl, which symbolized bad omen, and engraved it in his soul, making it his own. With this kind of evil spirit, Reynolds had the means to deal with servants. After all, the servant was essentially a kind of spirit. If he could rely on the evil spirit to remove the servants from the human world and devour them, then Reynolds would have the power to fight against the servants. Unfortunately, that idea was unrealistic, because the summoned evil spirits were at most mid-level servants, but almost all of the servants were high-level servants. Some of them could even be ranked as high-level servants. As spirits, they were just below gods. It was impossible for a mere mid-level servant to devour them. With Reynolds' mind, he naturally understood that, and he wouldn't naively think that an intermediate familiar could defeat all the servants. However, even so, Reynolds still regarded devil summoning as his trump card. Even if it can't remove and devour the servants, it can at least cause a certain degree of impact, right? No matter what, the evil spirit specialized in restraining the spirits. Even if it couldn't devour the servants, there should be a way to affect them. At this time, that conjecture was confirmed. Pow! Inside Blake's body, the owl that only Reynolds could see was like a woodpecker. Its sharp little beak forcefully pierced into Blake's spirit core, causing the spirit core to emit cracking sounds and tremble. Roar! There seemed to be a hint of pain in Blake's roar. Although the evil spirit's restraint couldn't remove Blake from the human world, it caused a little blow to him. Whenever the owl pierced the spirit core with its beak, Blake would feel a pain from his soul, causing the top-level servant's body and movements to stagnate from time to time. The time of stagnation was very short. Even a high-level servant might not be able to catch the flaw in such a short period of time, including Avina. However, Avina couldn't catch the flaw, but Reynolds could. It was Reynolds who manipulated the evil spirit to attack. Reynolds could naturally calculate the timing of the flaw and instruct Avina to attack. Under Reynolds's instruction, Avina swung the huge shield fiercely and smashed it on Blake's body. Bang! In the heavy impact, Blake's incomparably sturdy body repeatedly retreated. Roar! Blake was furious beyond measure. To put it bluntly, this servant could definitely be ranked among the highest level of familiars. On the other hand, Avina hadn't fully mastered the servant's power, and her combat experience was very low. Her strength was at best at the level of a superior familiar. Only when her defense reached the level of a superior familiar could she confront Blake. But it was just a confrontation. It was still difficult to defeat Blake. But now, with Renault's 3 major reinforcements, AI Wayna had the upper hand. How could Blake not be angry? Even if he had lost his mind, the only thing he couldn't get rid of was this violent anger. The beast-like servant roared, regardless of the severe pain from the spirit core, and launched a desperate counterattack. Clang! Under the sound of the axe hitting the shield, sparks began to splatter. The power was actually a bit stronger than before. Avina only felt a huge force from the shield, and she couldn't help but take a few steps back. Chapter 590. Blake immediately rushed out like a cannonball. The axe and sword in his hand turned into a storm, constantly greeting Avina's body. In the sound of metal collision, the giant man who turned into a meat grinder and the girl who was struggling to support the shield were still fighting fiercely. Sure enough, it's not that easy. In the rear, Reynolds's body became more and more shaky, as if he could fall at any time. Indeed, with the help of the demon's summoning, Reynolds was able to cause a certain interference and influence to the human servant, but it was not without a price. The price to pay for summoning this kind of familiar was that it consumed a lot of magic power. In addition, Reynolds also provided a large amount of mana to Avina, strengthening her strength. The two added together caused the originally considerable amount of mana in Reynolds' body to be consumed at an extremely fast speed like flowing water. This led to the beginning of Avina's enhancement began to decline, and the influence of the summoned demon on Blake was also getting smaller and smaller. The chance of winning against Blake was less than 10%. Even with the help of the demon, which increased the chance of winning by 10%, and the blessing of the command spell, which increased the chance of winning by 10%, the chance of winning is less than 30%. That is, Reynolds was very clear that even if he went all out with the help of Avina's power, the chance of winning was less than 50%. Because of this, the rest of the chance of winning can only be found in other places. If there was no chance of winning, then just create a chance of winning. Blake is strong, but his weakness is also very obvious. That is, he has no sense of reason. In that case, some small tricks may come in handy. Reynolds tried to squeeze out the remaining magical power in his body. The situation of the battle changed in an instant. Just when Blake arrived at a certain position and was ready to swing a powerful blow to Avina, a gray wolf lying on the side suddenly opened its eyes, roared, jumped from the ground, and rushed toward Blake's direction. It was the wolf servant that was used as a scapegoat by Reynolds and had long been ignored by everyone. As a result, Blake, who was preparing to deal a powerful blow to Avina, did not even have the time to swing his sword down before the gray wolf pounced forward and bit Blake's thick arm. Of course, this wolf was only a low-level familiar. It was impossible for it to bite through Blake's tough skin. However, the demonic spirits that Reynolds controlled were not limited to wolves. Boom! The ground beneath Blake's feet suddenly collapsed. A few demonic ants had dived into the ground and dug through the ground where Blake was standing. They used their sharp feet to hold Blake's lower body tightly. Blake was dragged into the ground by the demonic ants one by one. Together with the rock slab, he sank into the ground. Roar! Blake's roar sounded like it came from the depths of hell. It rose up from the collapsed ground, sending chills down one's spine. Now, however, Reynolds was unforgiving. He clenched his teeth and no longer held back the magic power in his body, releasing all of it. An exquisite magic circle spun under his feet, causing the demonic ants to come out one by one. This time, the number of demonic ants that were summoned was almost more than 100. The densely packed demonic ants suddenly rushed into the collapsed cave like a stampede of beasts amidst the sounds of their mouths rubbing against each other. Roar! Roar! Blake could not stop his roar. Taking a closer look at the bottom of the hole that had been dug to an unknown depth, a dense swarm of demonic ants swarmed onto Blake's body, entangling him. Blake struggled with all his might. The axe in his hand was like an extremely heavy meat saw, smashing, crushing, and cutting off the demonic ants that were clinging to his body. Minced meat and blood splattered everywhere, dyeing the bottom of the cave red. However, at this time, the advantage of the demonic ants' numbers came into play. A single demonic ant would naturally not be able to deal with a monster like Blake. However, hundreds of demonic ants climbed onto Blake's body. Coupled with their monstrous strength that was comparable to a superior familiar, even a servant like Blake was entangled and could only struggle desperately. In order to get rid of these demonic ants, Blake had to kill them one by one. However, Reynolds would not give Blake such a chance. Avina. Reynolds' face was pale. He supported his exhausted body and gave his last order to Iwina. Bury that monster alive. Upon hearing this, Avina did as she was told without hesitation. Ah! While shouting with all her might, Iwina leapt into the air with her shield in hand. She was like a meteor as the back of the shield landed heavily on the ground. Boom! Following a loud boom, Iwina's all-out attack successfully shattered the ground, causing cracks to spread out around the cave, and finally, the cave collapsed once again. Obviously, when Avina was fighting, Reynolds had already manipulated the demonic ants to dig through the ground. Countless gravel and rocks suddenly rolled down. Rumble, as the ground trembled, rocks and rocks gradually buried Blake and the densely packed demonic ant army at the bottom of the cave. Dust rose into the air like smoke. After an unknown amount of time, the gravel and rocks completely buried the hole, leaving a big hole filled with rubble in Fuyuki City. When the last gravel stopped rolling, everything was as if the dust had settled and silence was restored. Did we win? Olga Marie, who was hiding in a building, looked at the situation and fearfully poked her head out. Reynolds seemed to be relieved, and his body fell to the side. Senpai. Seeing this, Avina quickly rushed over, and before Reynolds was about to fall to the ground, she smoothly caught him. Phew, phew. Reynolds leaned on Avina's body, extremely tired and panting. Looking at his extremely pale face, anyone could tell that Reynolds' magical power had been exhausted. He had provided a large amount of mana to Arwina and summoned an evil spirit that consumed a lot of mana. In the end, he had even summoned over 100 magic ants. It would be strange if he didn't exhaust his mana. Now, Reynolds felt that his body had become extremely empty, and the magic circuit had also stopped operating. It gradually dimmed like an electric circuit that had been turned off. At the same time, Avina's skyrocketing power also gradually disappeared, and even the command seal's strengthening had reached its limit. Senpai, are you okay? Chapter 591. Roar. AI Wayna asked Reynolds worriedly, ignoring the power she was losing. I'm fine, Reynolds shook his head, but his tone was extremely weak. Please wait, I'll let you rest immediately. Awina helped Reynolds up and was about to take him to rest. In response, Reynolds shook his head again. Now is not the time to do this kind of thing, Reynolds said in a hurry. It's impossible to defeat Blake with this method. At most, it can only delay the time. Before he comes out of the ground, we should leave quickly. If a servant would die because of being buried alive, then the so-called heroic spirit would be too cheap. There was no way Averna didn't understand that. Got it. Let's retreat now. Avina helped Reynolds up and immediately planned to leave. As a result, the two of them underestimated Blake. Crack. When such a cracking sound came from the ground behind Reynolds and Iwina, causing the ground to crack open, the bodies of the two who were about to leave completely froze. At the same time, their eyes gradually enlarged in the eyes of the man and the woman. Fo, who was running from the front and was about to rush into AI Wena's arms, stopped and let out a sorrowful cry. Calmephala, who was about to come out of the building, also screamed. On the other hand, Renaud and Avina couldn't react in time. The next moment, boom! Under the explosion, the ground behind the two shattered. A giant man with a terrifying aura came out from there. Roar, 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 roar. Releasing a furious roar that sounded like a death announcement, Blake crawled out from the ground covered in demonic ants. He raised the axe in his hand high up towards Renaud and Avina, who had their backs to him. Under such circumstances, it was impossible for the two of them to escape in time. Especially Avina. In the face of this sudden situation, it was as if she had turned back into a weak girl. She couldn't turn her head smoothly. In the end, there was only one person who could move. That was Reynolds. Reynolds's last action was also very simple. He mercilessly pushed away Avina, who was mercilessly supporting him. Senior. Avina let out a cry of surprise. Her body was violently pushed away, and she fell to the side. This fall allowed Avina to escape the attack range of the axe and sword. The axe and sword hacked down heavily. Soon after, it landed on Reynolds's body amidst the shocking energy. Bam! The sound of the collision, which made people's hearts stop beating, echoed in the sky. The blow, which was powerful enough to shatter the rock plate, sent Reynolds flying like a bullet. He shot into the distance and crashed into a pile of ruins. This scene made Avina's mind go blank. By the time he reacted, Avina let out a terrifying cry that she had never let out before. As tears flowed down from the corners of her eyes, she raised her shield without regard for anything else and charged towards Blake. The impact was like an explosion. Under this impact, the ground shattered again. Two servants fell into the pit at the same time. Along with countless rubble, they fell into the bottomless pit. Boom! 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 The sound of rubble rolling down could be heard incessantly in the collapsed cave. Comabris stared blankly at this scene. He watched as Mano fell into the pit, and even more so as he watched the collapsed pit being buried. His face turned pale. Mano. It was a long time before Calmephala finally made a move. She ran out of the building like a madwoman and ran towards the collapsed pit. Fo also ran to the edge of the collapsed hole and kept calling out, as if it was calling its owner's name. Mano! Standing in front of the dust-filled crater, Calmephala shouted non-stop. Of course, no one would respond to Calmephala's call. Mano. At this moment, Calmephala sat on the ground with a dull expression. His heart was completely wrapped by a sense of despair. What to do? Calmephala muttered in a daze. Lorelei, Mano, these two companions were not easy to obtain, but now they had both fallen into a situation where it was unknown whether they were dead or alive, leaving Calmephala alone once again. Fo didn't seem to give up. We saw the pit was filled and couldn't find Mano. He turned around and ran in another direction. That was the direction where Renaud was sent flying. However, Calmephala didn't go to find Renaud like Fo did, because Calmephala knew that Renaud's physique was worse than ordinary people. He couldn't survive a direct hit from Calmephala. What to do? In the face of this situation, the leader of Chaldea completely lost his sense of propriety and showed the fragile side of his heart. At this moment, Calmephala was just an ordinary girl. But at this moment, are you looking for this little girl? Amidst the wild and unruly laughter, Calmephala jumped up like a frightened rabbit. But in the next second, Calmephala let out a surprised cry. Mano, Manual, who should have fallen into the ground with him, was actually held in the hands of a magician who looked like a sage. He fell from the sky. That was really scary. If I didn't come in time, you wouldn't be saved, little girl. Sage let out a hearty laugh as he said that. You? Who are you? Calmephala immediately questioned the sage. The sage didn't hide anything. Townsend's follower. Well, I'm not your enemy, so don't be too wary of me. With that said, Townsend put down Mano. However, Mano's condition wasn't very good. Not only was he covered in mud, but he also had tears on his face. He looked very pitiful. As soon as Ma Nual landed on the ground, he immediately ran forward without caring about anything else. Senpai! Senpai! Mano ran toward the direction where Foe just ran. Wait! Mano! Kelmephala first called Mano, then he glared at Townsend. While guarding against the sudden appearance of a servant, he moved closer to Mano's direction. It seems that I'm hated. Townsend shrugged. He didn't feel that the situation was tricky at all. Instead, with a relaxed expression, he followed the footsteps of everyone. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.